Imagine standing alone at dusk on a ridge above an ancient earthwork, the sky bruised purple and gold, the last light sinking behind a black line of trees. Wind moves through the grass in slow, restless waves. Somewhere far off, thunder rolls over the horizon, low and patient, as if reminding this place how long it has been listening. Under your boots, the ground rises in a deliberate curve, not a natural hill, a design. As the light fades, the outline sharpens. A serpent, more than 1,000 feet long, uncoiling across the Ohio hillside, its earthen body aligned with solstices and distant lunar standstills. For generations, researchers have mapped every contour, measured every angle, traced every possible star it might mirror. Yet no inscription explains who first imagined this ceremonial giant, or why a culture without metal tools chose to move the earth itself into the shape of a sky-watching snake. These mounds, these stones, these carved cliffs have watched thousands of winters pass. They have seen comets burn across the night, eclipses turn a day into a brief, terrified twilight, rivers change course, forests rise and fall. Civilizations have come and gone around them. This was not a single moment in time. This was a civilization of genuine complexity, stretching across valleys and plains, building with soil and sandstone instead of marble and steel, leaving almost no written records in the European sense. Far to the southwest, cliff faces glow in the last embers of sunset, and high in their shadows sit the empty dwellings of Chaco Canyon and Mesa Verde. Great houses built from millions of sandstone blocks, timber carried from forests more than 50 miles away, rooms aligned to the sun and moon with unnerving precision. Now only swallows nest in the doorways. The people who engineered this network of roads, kivas and plazas spoke through architecture and ceremony, not through ink on paper, and what you are left with is absence that feels intentional. Across the Mississippi floodplain, the outlines of Cahokia's massive earthworks emerge as the sky darkens. A city that once rivaled medieval London in size rises again in the imagination. Plazas crowded, fires burning, traders arriving from the Great Lakes with copper and from the Gulf with shells. Then, within a few generations, collapse. No chronicles, no royal decrees, only abandoned mounds and scattered artifacts that refuse to tell a single, simple story. Here is what makes these mysteries different. Lasers can strip away forests, satellites can trace forgotten roads, excavation can reveal trade patterns and diets and droughts, yet some questions remain untouched at the core. Why a 300-foot serpent? Why cities in marginal deserts? Why copper mined in staggering quantities around the Great Lakes, then disappearing into a silence the archaeological record cannot fully break? So, settle in, because what you're about to discover is not just a catalogue of ancient puzzles, but a challenge to the way human history has been imagined. By the end of this descent into earthworks, rock art, and abandoned cities, the familiar American landscape may never look ordinary again. So settle in, because the mystery unfolding in North America does not stand alone. It sits in quiet contrast to other ancient landscapes around the world. Imagine walking among the pyramids of Egypt, the stelae of Maya cities, the carved stones of Mesopotamia. There, kings named themselves. Wars, rituals, and dynasties were etched into stone. Texts argue with texts. Inscriptions answer at least as many questions as they raise. Here, across the American continent, the silence is different. No hieroglyphic staircases recounting royal bloodlines. No carved law codes or marble archives. What remains instead are earthworks, mounds, petroglyphs, abandoned great houses, and the living memory held in indigenous oral traditions. Geometry without a written theorem, cities without a surviving chronicle, a ceremonial landscape that speaks in alignments, horizons, and stories, carried by descendants rather than stone-written chronicles. For generations, researchers have tried to translate this quieter record. Archaeologists sift soil for broken pottery and charred seeds. Anthropologists compare myths, clan structures, and migration accounts. Astronomers model solstice lines and lunar standstills at places like Serpent Mound and Chaco Canyon. Indigenous knowledge keepers bring forward songs, protocols, and explanations rooted in responsibilities to land. Yet key questions remain unresolved. Why did a 300-foot earthen serpent in Ohio need to coil itself towards specific sunsets and stars? Why did great houses rise in a harsh canyon, then fall silent? Some mysteries don't surrender their secrets easily. High-resolution LiDAR can peel back forest canopies to reveal hidden platforms and forgotten mounds. Radiocarbon dating can pin a beam from Chaco or Cahokia to a particular decade. Satellite imagery can trace ancient roadways and trade routes stretching for hundreds of miles. But measurements are not the same as meaning. The numbers stop where interpretation begins, and there the gaps widen. Here is what makes these places so challenging. They are not random ruins. They are expressions of ancient knowledge systems that fused sky, soil, season, and ceremony into one continuous fabric. Cosmologies were mapped onto the ground through earthworks that track solstices and eclipses. Ceremonial calendars were embedded in the very architecture of plazas and mounds, turning cities into instruments that could measure time. Ecological expertise guided where to plant, when to burn, how to move along rivers and through deserts without exhausting the land. This was not a single isolated culture experimenting in a vacuum. Around the Great Lakes, ancient copper mines fed a trade network reaching far beyond what surviving artifacts can explain. In the Mississippi Valley, Cahokia rose to rival medieval London in population, then faced transformation and collapse. Across the southwest, petroglyphs seem to record supernovas, droughts, and visions in a language of spirals and stars that still resist definitive translation. What you're left with is a challenge. To see these mysteries clearly is to confront the limits of modern certainty about science, engineering, and spirituality in the ancient world. To recognize that this was a civilization of genuine complexity is to change how the American continent itself is imagined, and the deeper these enigmas are traced, from serpent-shaped embankments to vanished roads, the more the next layer of questions begins to emerge. Those next layers are not in a single site or a single culture. They are scattered across a continent, embedded in earthworks, cliff dwellings, abandoned plazas, and carved stone. To trace them, the journey has to move carefully, mystery by mystery, landscape by landscape. Imagine standing first above a coiled ridge of soil in southern Ohio, a 300-foot serpent unspooling across a plateau. The episode will open there, with a slow descent into the Serpent Mound's curves, following the line of its jaw toward the setting sun and the stars it seems to mirror. From that atmosphere, the camera will move into the known, radiocarbon dates, alignments with solstices and lunar standstills, fragments of pottery and charcoal. Here is what makes this earthwork so unsettling for researchers. No consensus on who ordered it built, no agreement on its original purpose, only competing theories of eclipse markers, underworld guardians, and ceremonial calendars. From Ohio, the focus shifts southwest, into canyons and high mesas where ancestral Puebloan masonry still clings to stone. A slow, reverent build will carry the viewer into Chaco Canyon's great houses, walls of sandstone blocks and ancient timbers hauled from more than 50 miles away. Then, on to Mesa Verde, where entire villages hang beneath overhanging cliffs. The pattern will repeat: immersion in the built environment, an introduction to a culture that engineered roads, kivas, and a vast trade network, followed by the stark question that haunts these sites. Not how they built them, but why these centers were abandoned after centuries of investment. Next comes Cahokia, rising from the Mississippi floodplain near present-day St. Louis. The pacing will quicken slightly as the camera climbs Monk's Mound and looks out over a city that once held perhaps 10,000 to 20,000 people. This was not a single ceremonial outpost. This was a civilization of genuine complexity, with neighborhoods, palisades, plazas, and a wooden solar observatory. For generations, researchers have debated its meteoric rise around 1050 CE and its later collapse. Climate stress, internal conflict, shifting trade, religious upheaval. What we are left with is a skyline of mounds and a silence where urban voices once echoed. Threaded between these monumental places, the episode will pause among boulders and canyon walls in the American Southwest, where rock art panels crowd with spirals, horned figures, thunderbirds, and shapes that resemble starbursts and eclipses. Some petroglyphs seem to match known supernovas, others defy every proposed key. The same measured structure returns: scene setting, cultural context, achievements of observation, then the unresolved question of meaning. Finally, the narrative will turn north and east to the Great Lakes, where ancient copper mines on Isle Royale and the Keweenaw Peninsula reveal deep pits, hammerstones and missing metal. Evidence of extraction on a massive scale, artifacts spread across the Midwest and beyond. Yet the total volume of copper removed dwarfs what has been found. Here, the mystery is not only how such work was organised without writing or wheels, but where that copper travelled and why those mining systems were eventually left behind. Throughout, indigenous perspectives and oral traditions will stand alongside academic research, not as background colour, but as parallel lines of knowledge. Elders' teachings about serpents, sky beings, migrations, and sacred metals will be acknowledged with care, even when they do not map neatly onto archaeological models. The tone will remain steady and contemplative, resisting sensational claims while refusing to close the door on what cannot yet be measured. So settle in. What you're about to discover is not just how ancient engineers aligned mounds to the heavens or carved stories into stone. The deeper tension running through each case study is why entire systems of belief and power were transformed, dispersed, or relinquished. Why cities the size of medieval London emptied. Why observatories went quiet. Why networks that once bound thousands of miles unravelled in ways that still baffle researchers. The next chapters will move into those places one by one and follow that pattern from evidence to enigma, from what can be mapped to what remains just out of reach. To follow that unravelling, the view has to narrow. From continents and vanished networks down to one ridge, one river, one quiet bend in the land where the mystery is not a ruined city or a toppled wall, but the earth itself reshaped into a living form. Imagine southern Ohio in late summer. Rolling hills rise and fall like slow waves, their slopes wrapped in dense hardwood forest. Mist hangs in the river valleys at dawn, dissolving into a heavy green stillness by midday. On one narrow plateau above a looping branch of Ohio Brush Creek, the grass looks ordinary from the ground, just a field on a high bluff. Yet beneath that thin skin of roots and soil, something enormous and deliberate has been waiting. Here, an ancient effigy lies pressed into the spine of the hill. For centuries it slept under leaves, under fallen branches, under the quiet of wind and snow. Perhaps for more than 1,000 years this shape endured while wars came and went, while new nations rose and mapped the land, while farmers ploughed fields just beyond its coils without ever seeing the full design. What was once a ceremonial landscape became pasture. The serpent sank back into anonymity. When it did re-enter the historical record in the 19th century, it did so not as a ruin of stone but as a revelation of contour. A body of earth more than 1,300 feet long, curling and uncoiling along the crest of the plateau, its open jaws framing what appears to be an egg or solar disk. No cut granite blocks, no towering walls, no palace foundations or throne rooms to announce a ruler's name. What stands here instead is an idea turned into topography. Here is what makes this effigy so challenging to place. The likely cultures associated with the region are known. The Adena, building burial mounds here more than 2,000 years ago. The later Fort Ancient people, whose villages and earthworks spread across the Ohio Valley many centuries after. Radiocarbon dates taken from the site have been read as evidence for one, then reinterpreted as evidence for the other. Some researchers even argue for an older, still unnamed tradition beneath them both. This was not a single moment of construction pinned neatly to one label. Unlike Old World monuments, there is no carved inscription to settle the debate, no written language in stone recording who ordered this vast earthwork raised or which cosmology it was meant to embody. Just soil piled basket by basket, aligned with solstice sunsets and lunar standstills, holding a geometry that suggests a civilization of genuine complexity, yet leaving almost nothing of its voice. So settle in at the edge of that plateau. In the mind's eye, step closer to the drop-off and look down, not at random ridges, but at a serpent that seems to flow with the hill itself, head poised at the cliff, tail coiled behind. Then ask the question that has haunted this place since its rediscovery. Whose imagination first saw a living snake in this spine of earth, and what were they trying to speak across 1,000 years of silence? From that question, let the ridge resolve into form. The vague impression of a snake becomes precise. A single, continuous body of earth, rising gently from the spine of the hill and flowing across it in measured, deliberate curves. This is not erosion. This is not an accident. This is a design pressed into the land with intention. Imagine standing at the tail. Behind, the hill narrows and drops away into forest. Ahead, the serpent's body coils into a tight spiral, a compact whirl of raised soil that circles in on itself before releasing into the first long curve. The tail is not a random loop. It is a controlled coil, its rings carefully proportioned, as if the creature has just gathered its power before uncoiling across the ridge. From that coil, the body undulates. Curve after curve, 7 great bends in all, roll along the narrow summit, each arc swelling and then narrowing, never quite repeating, like a slow wave captured in earth. No straight lines, no jagged angles, only a sinuous motion that seems to echo the ancient river below and the path of constellations above. Here is what makes it so striking. Even from the ground, the body feels alive, yet its true scale resists comprehension at eye level. The serpent stretches roughly 1,348 feet from tail to head, longer than 4 football fields laid end to end, its width shifting from about 20 to over 25 feet, its height rising to several feet above the natural surface. It occupies nearly the entire length of the ridge, its body aligned with the spine of the hill, as if the land itself has become a backbone. This was not a single casual project. Moving that much soil with baskets and hands required coordination, planning, and time. At the far end, the head emerges. Broad, slightly triangular, it faces the cliff edge, its open jaws embracing or presenting an oval rise of earth. An egg, some have called it. Others see a solar disk, a ceremonial offering, a captured prey. The head and egg together form a tableau that has fueled theories for generations. Researchers have traced alignments here to sunsets, solstices, and lunar extremes, but the physical impression remains simple and arresting. A serpent in the act of swallowing or giving birth. From the ground, the pattern is powerful but fragmented. Walk along the body and each bend dominates the horizon. The whole creature slips out of view. Early surveyors in the 19th century had to pace and sketch, translating rises and hollows into flattened drawings before the serpent truly appeared on paper. Only with those maps, and later with aerial photography, did the complete design become undeniable. From above, the ridge is no longer a random spine of glacial debris. It is a canvas. The serpent is the image. Around it, the landscape thickens the mystery. Nearby stand low, rounded burial mounds, echoes of other ceremonial earthworks in the Ohio River Valley, part of a wider culture that raised embankments, circles, and geometric enclosures at places like the Newark earthworks. Beyond the ridge, the ground drops into what many geologists interpret as the rim of an ancient impact crater, as if an event from deep cosmic time once shattered the bedrock beneath this sacred hill. This was a civilization of genuine complexity, one that folded astronomy, geometry, and ceremony into living terrain, yet left no written explanation of intent. No palace ruins, no carved stelae, no royal inscriptions. What they left instead was a serpent that only fully reveals itself from a vantage point almost no human of that era could have occupied. So settle in with that realization for a moment. All this labor, all this precision, for a figure whose wholeness is clearest from the sky or from an abstract plan. What you're about to discover in the next moments is the first deep layer of the puzzle. Who exactly was meant to see this being in its entirety, and from where did that gaze fall? From that imagined vantage point in the sky, the serpent's body is not just art, it is orientation, it is direction. As the sun drops toward the western horizon on the longest day of the year, the line from the serpent's coiled tail through its undulating body aims the gaze toward a very specific place, the point where the summer solstice sun sinks into the distant hills. Imagine standing at the serpent's head on that evening. The open jaws, the oval form often described as an egg, or the sun itself, and the horizon beyond line up in a way that feels less like coincidence and more like choreography. Early surveyors working with chains and compasses, and later archaeoastronomers with theodolites and GPS, have traced those sight lines. Their measurements suggest that other coils may echo equinox sunsets and sunrises as well, tying this ancient earthwork to the turning points of the solar year. Here is what makes this alignment so striking. The builders had no metal instruments, No written tables of declination, no modern observatories. What they had instead was patience, generations of watching where the sun rose and set year after year, fixing those positions against the same ridge, the same distant notches, the same silhouettes of trees. Over time, those observations could be translated into earth and clay, into a ceremonial geometry that turned the ridge itself into a living calendar. But the sun is only half the mystery. Some researchers argue that key points along the Serpent's curves correspond to what are called lunar standstills, the extreme north and south positions of the moon in its 18.6-year cycle. Not the everyday wanderings of the moon across the sky. The long rhythm, the slow breathing of the lunar orbit that only reveals itself when a culture watches carefully not for seasons, but for generations. For generations, researchers have walked the length of Serpent Mound with survey rods, total stations, and now drone-based mapping. Engineers analyze the proportional spacing of the coils. Ornithologists, trained to notice patterns in sweeping curves and natural forms, have joined archaeoastronomers to model sightlines from specific posts and platforms. Their findings converge. The serpent's body is not random. Distances between bends repeat in ratios. Angles recur. This was not a single casual sketch in soil. This was a civilization of genuine complexity encoding knowledge in measured arcs. Skeptical voices urge caution. With a figure this long and a sky this full of rising and setting bodies, alignments can appear by chance. One or two correspondences might be coincidence, a pattern imposed by modern minds hungry for meaning. Yet as more solar points, more lunar extremes, more proportional relationships stack up, even conservative scholars acknowledge intentional astronomical design at the heart of the earthwork. So settle in with the implication of that acknowledgement. If Serpent Mound is an earthbound sky map, a ceremonial calendar pressed into the ridge, then people once gathered here not just to mark time, but to enact stories and responsibilities tied to those cycles. What songs were sung when the solstice sun slid into the serpent's jaws? What vows were renewed when the moon reached its farthest standstill and paused on the horizon? And perhaps most haunting of all, what changed in this network of belief, trade and obligation, so that those vigils ended, the watchers departed, and the sky kept moving over a silent serpent, waiting for someone to remember what it was meant to say next. So settle in with that image of a silent serpent under a moving sky, because the next question cuts even deeper than alignments or ceremonies. Who first called this being out of the earth? Who decided that this ridge in southern Ohio would become a coiled horizon of packed soil and intention? Researchers do not agree. The traditional candidate is the Adena culture, an early woodland mound-building civilization active around 1000 to 200 BCE. Their burial mounds surround the hilltop, and Adena artifacts appear in the nearby landscape. It would be easy to imagine them extending that ritual presence into a great effigy, a serpent stretching more than us 300 feet along the spine of the ridge, its coils flowing around older Adena constructions. But then come the fort ancient people. Later woodland farmers, living roughly 1000 to 1650 CE, whose villages and refuse pits lie closer in time to the radiocarbon dates taken from parts of the Serpent Mound itself. Some charcoal samples from the embankment suggest construction or major modification around the 11th or 12th century, centuries after the Adena had faded. Here is what makes the question so persistent. The evidence does not fall into a single, clean layer. Soil profiles along the serpent's body show complex stratigraphy. Charcoal from one depth points toward Adena-era burning, while material from another horizon hints at Fort Ancient activity. A few artifacts, including pottery fragments and stone tools, belong to different cultural phases entirely. No written records, no clear explanation, just overlapping traces and the unsettling sense that this was not a single moment of creation. It may have been a palimpsest, renewed, reshaped, reimagined over more than 1,000 years. Imagine the same ridge visited by different communities, each inheriting an older earthwork or sacred place. Some theories argue that Adena people first marked out a simpler mound here, perhaps even a different effigy form, and that later Fort Ancient groups carved the serpent's precise curves and astronomical sightlines into that inheritance. Other scholars suggest an even earlier, poorly understood phase, hinted at by outlying dates that do not sit comfortably with either culture. For generations, researchers have tried to force these numbers into a single story, the land refuses. To understand that refusal, the serpent has to be seen within its wider network. The Ohio Valley is crowded with ancient earthworks, Adena and Hopewell burial mounds, vast geometric enclosures at Newark and elsewhere, embankments aligned to solstices, lunar standstills and river courses. This was a civilization of genuine complexity, where ceremonial centres rose and declined, where trade radiated out along rivers carrying copper, shell and obsidian, and where certain hilltops and valleys were used again and again for rites no outsider has ever fully grasped. Indigenous oral histories from Shawnee, Haudenosaunee and other nations speak of horned serpents, underwater panthers, and powerful earth beings that inhabit thresholds between worlds. These beings guard water, control storms and enforce covenants. Some native elders have cautiously linked such narratives to places like Serpent Mound, suggesting that the effigy participates in a much deeper cosmology of balance and danger. Yet these stories are not simple keys to decode the site. They are living teachings, not archaeological captions. What we are left with is a carefully measured uncertainty. Charcoal, soil layers and artifacts outline a sequence of use, but not a definitive first vision. No single culture can be named without hesitation. No single event can be pointed to as the night the serpent was born. The debate itself becomes part of the mystery, preparing the ground for an even larger question. How do you trace the rise and transformation of entire ceremonial landscapes when the earthworks are clearer than the people who once moved among them? So settle in at the edge of that coiled ridge, because the next question is not who built the Serpent Mound, but why anyone would command such an undertaking in the first place. No written charter, no dedicatory plaque, just a 1,300-foot serpent etched into the spine of an ancient landscape, daring researchers to explain its purpose. Imagine the entire earthwork as a clock made of soil and horizon. For generations, researchers have traced sightlines from the serpent's coils to the setting sun on the summer solstice, to the rising sun on the winter solstice, to key points in the lunar cycle. The head seems to face the sunset on the longest day. Certain bends line up with equinoxes and major lunar standstills. This is not casual. This is precision built into grass and clay. Yet even as the alignments impress, they do not decode the whole design. Others see it less as a static calendar and more as a ceremonial pathway. The serpent's body, with its rhythmic undulations, can be walked. Step by step, coil by coil, the earth itself becomes a processional route, a vision path guiding participants through stages of a ritual. No walls, no temples, just the body of a mythic being turned into a corridor of experience. Here is what makes this theory compelling. It treats the mound as an action, not an object. There is also the possibility of territory and identity. A massive serpent cresting a bluff above a river valley would have been visible from a distance, a kind of living boundary marker announcing the presence and power of a particular culture. Not a fence, a statement, a declaration that this was not a single village, but a civilization of genuine complexity, capable of projecting its stories across the land itself. Yet the ground complicates easy answers. Around the Serpent Mound, archaeologists have found burial mounds, some predating and some possibly contemporary with the serpent. Human remains, grave goods, the quiet evidence of funerary ceremony. But within the serpent's own body, burials are rare and ambiguous. No dense cemetery, no central tomb beneath the head. If this is a grave marker, it is an unusually empty one. Some scholars instead speak of a cosmogram, a three-dimensional map of the universe rendered in Earth. In many native traditions, serpents and horned snakes link sky, surface, and underworld, mediating between realms of rain, lightning, and the waters below. The egg-like oval at the head might be the sun, the moon, a star, a world egg, or a portal. The coils could trace celestial paths. The bluff itself sits atop what some geologists interpret as an ancient impact structure, tying an already charged form to a charged piece of ground. Each theory illuminates one facet and leaves others in shadow. Calendars explain the alignments, but not every curve. Funerary readings echo in nearby graves, but falter inside the serpent's hollow body. Cosmological models speak to the mythic serpent and the egg, yet do not fully answer why this exact ridge, this possible crater, this particular scale. What we are left with is a careful vocabulary of maybes. Researchers speak of likely alignments, probable rituals, possible cosmologies. Indigenous knowledge keepers offer teachings and analogies while guarding what must remain within their own communities. No one claims final certainty. The serpent endures as an ancient question inscribed into the land, and for now, The most honest answer is that its original purpose remains partly veiled, inviting the next line of inquiry rather than closing the case. The serpent remains on its ridge, silent. Uncoiled across 1,148 feet of earth and grass, it still raises the same unsettling question that no survey, no excavation, no astronomical model has been able to fully resolve. Why this form? At this scale? In this place? Not a circle, not a simple mound, a living shape, frozen in soil. For generations, researchers have measured every curve, mapped every alignment, sifted every layer of charcoal and soil. Evidence points to solstices and eclipses, to lunar standstills and horizon points. Theories speak of underworld beings, sky serpents, fertility, renewal, warnings. Yet the core decision remains obscured. Out of all possible images, this ancient culture chose a serpent that seems to swallow an egg at the edge of a cliff, facing the setting sun. Here is what makes that so haunting. Even with all of this data, the original intention still slips just out of reach. Imagine stepping back from that hilltop and looking across the entire continent. The Serpent Mound is not an isolated anomaly. It is one voice in a vast chorus of places where extraordinary effort and precision were poured into landscape, followed, in time, by partial abandonment and interpretive gaps. Cahokia's towering earthen pyramid near present-day St. Louis rises from the floodplain, a monument from a city that once may have rivaled medieval London in population, then experienced a rapid collapse. Great Lakes copper mines show thousands of years of extraction, yet the full extent of that metal's journey through trade networks is still unknown. This was not a single burst of inspiration. This was a civilization of genuine complexity spread over regions and centuries, leaving behind earthworks, roads, plazas, and ceremonial architecture that can be mapped in exquisite detail but not fully translated. No written chronicles, no royal decrees, no carved biographies of rulers. What they left instead were engineered horizons, alignments to stars and patterns of movement etched into the land itself. So settle in, because what you're about to discover is that some of the greatest enigmas are no longer just singular mounds or lone petroglyph panels, but entire designed landscapes. In the high desert of the American Southwest, architecture does not simply sit on the land. It converses with mesas and canyons, with shadow and light, with the paths of the sun and moon. Their low stone walls unfold into great houses with hundreds of rooms. Roads run straight for miles, cutting across difficult terrain with a focus that defies easy practical explanation. The tone shifts as the forested hills of Ohio fall away. In their place rise sheer sandstone cliffs, dry washes, and blue horizons broken by distant buttes. The air is thinner, the colours harsher. Yet the same pattern emerges, immense labour invested in places that seem, to modern eyes, marginal. In Chaco Canyon, millions of sandstone blocks and timbers hauled from over 50 miles away were assembled into vast ceremonial and residential complexes, all in a landscape of short growing seasons and uncertain rain. Here, disappearance takes on a different, more haunting form. Entire canyon walls once dotted with fires, voices and ritual movement now echo with wind. Rooms that once stored corn and ritual objects stand empty, their plastered walls crumbling. Archaeologists can map every stone, reconstruct trade routes, even infer astronomical observations from window placements and sightlines. But the question remains, why were these cities of stone so carefully aligned and meticulously maintained, left behind within a relatively short span of time? What we are left with are roads that lead outward into the desert and then simply fade, stairways carved into cliff faces that climb toward abandoned mesas, and kivas roofed long ago that now lie open to the sky. In the next segment, the path will follow those routes into the heart of Chaco and beyond, walking through great houses that once held life, sound, and ceremony, and then, almost abruptly, were surrendered to the wind and sand, leaving behind a mystery as stark and enduring as the canyon walls themselves. Imagine walking off those ancient roads, and suddenly realizing they do not lead to a single monument, but into an entire world. Stone cities in the desert, towers tucked into cliffs, ceremonial chambers sunk into the earth. This was not a single isolated settlement scattered across empty rock. This was a civilization of genuine complexity, unfolding across centuries in a landscape that seems almost designed to resist it. Today they are called the ancestral Puebloans, the forebears of living Pueblo peoples such as the Hopi, Zuni, and many communities along the Rio Grande. For generations, researchers have used another name, Anasazi, a Navajo term that can carry the meaning ancient enemies. Many descendants regard it as pejorative. The shift in language is not just politeness, it is a recognition that these are not vanished strangers, but ancestors whose descendants still carry songs, stories, and ceremonial knowledge linked to these stones. Their story in this region begins long before the great houses rose from the canyon floors. Around the first millennium CE, small farming villages appeared on high mesas and along arroyos, as families experimented with maize agriculture, dryland farming, and water control in an unforgiving environment. Over the next centuries, those scattered hamlets would coalesce, expand, and align, building toward a fluorescence of monumental architecture between roughly 850 and 1300 CE in what is now called the Four Corners region, where New Mexico, Arizona, Colorado, and Utah meet. Here is what makes that achievement so striking. The setting is not a lush river valley or a coastal plain, but high desert plateaus and carved sandstone canyons. Rainfall is sparse and erratic. Summers can sear, winters can freeze, and the temperature can swing dramatically between day and night. To sustain large populations here required careful planning, deep environmental knowledge, and social organization tuned to every drop of water and every patch of cultivable soil. Within this demanding world, two centers came to symbolize both the brilliance and the mystery of the ancestral Puebloan cultural sphere. Chaco Canyon, in present-day northwestern New Mexico, became a nexus of great houses, kivas, and engineered roads, its multi-story masonry blocks and timber roofs rising in a place where arable land and wood are scarce. To the north, on the mesas of southwestern Colorado, Mesa Verde grew into a cluster of spectacular cliff dwellings, entire communities tucked beneath overhanging rock, accessible by hand and toe holds, ladders, and narrow ledges. Archaeologists can map every room, trace every wall, follow road segments that run arrow straight across miles of desert. Yet the reasons these centers were eventually abandoned remain contested. Drought, social stress, shifting trade networks, religious transformation, and political reorganization all appear in the theories. None alone feel sufficient. What we are left with are stone shells that hint at decisions made in council rooms and kivas, choices that redirected lives on a continental scale. So settle in, because Chaco and Mesa Verde were never lonely outposts. They anchored a vast network of communities, ceremonial sites, and exchange routes stretching across the American Southwest, reaching toward the Rio Grande, the Mogollon Rim, and beyond. In the next segment, the focus will narrow to Chaco's canyon floor, to those great houses and their roads, in search of the order and the enigma encoded in their very foundations. So settle in as the view drops from the mesa rims down into the canyon itself. Chaco is not a lush river valley or an easy oasis. It is a broad, dry wash carved into the San Juan Basin, a shallow, sandy floor flanked by sheer sandstone cliffs that glow gold at sunrise and bleed crimson at dusk, holding heat, holding silence, holding memory. Imagine walking that barren floor and suddenly encountering geometry. Out of the dust rise massive multi-story buildings, the great houses, shouldering up against the emptiness in carefully aligned rows. No random clusters, no haphazard sprawl, no simple village of scattered rooms. What stands here are monumental facades, tiered walls and terraced stories that once reached 4 or even 5 levels high. Their arcs and angles echoing the canyon's own curving walls. Here is what makes these ruins more than picturesque remnants. Great houses like Pueblo Bonito were assembled from millions of sandstone blocks, each one shaped by hand, each one fitted into intricate masonry patterns. Thin stone veneers alternate with core rubble, forming walls that are both strong and elegant. The timber beams that span ceilings and support upper floors do not belong to this desert at all. Dendrochronology shows they came from high-elevation forests, hauled in from mountain ranges more than 50 miles away, dragged or carried without draft animals or wheeled vehicles across harsh, broken terrain. This was not a single construction episode. Generations added wings, stories, and refinements, knitting together a plan that feels both rigidly ordered and slowly evolved. Inside Pueblo Bonito alone, there are hundreds of rooms, some tiny storage cells, others broad halls. Round, sunken kivas punctuate the plazas, ceremonial chambers with bench-lined interiors and roof openings that framed sky and smoke. T-shaped doorways repeat from room to room and house to house, an architectural signature that may have signaled status, movement, or passage between worlds. The entire layout seems to converse with the horizon. Walls and sightlines align with the cardinal directions, with solstice sunrise and sunset points, with distant buttes and mountain peaks. Plazas open toward gaps in the cliffs. Lines of rooms trace arcs that mirror lunar standstill positions. This was a civilization of genuine complexity, one that embedded its ceremonial calendar and cosmology into stone rather than script. Beyond the canyon floor, another design emerges. From Chaco radiate engineered roads, some 30 feet wide, extending straight as if drawn with a ruler for miles across the desert. They cut over ridges, slice through low hills, and drop into arroyos with stair-like ramps, showing little regard for the easiest path. For generations, researchers have traced these corridors to outlying great houses, shrines, and distant communities, evidence of a regional network that once pulsed with movement, trade, and ritual. And yet, the setting resists easy explanation. Limited surface water, thin, unreliable soils, short growing seasons, and brutal drought cycles. Why concentrate such enormous labour into a ceremonial and administrative centre here, in a place that seems to push people away rather than welcome them? What you're left with is a blueprint of intention without a clear motive, a finished plan in an unfinished story that the next segment will begin to unravel in the skies above Chaco's stone horizons. So settle in, because what you're about to discover is that those stone horizons were never just walls and windows. They were instruments. Imagine walking into one of Chaco's great houses at its height, the air cool in the shadowed corridors, the plaza alive with colour and sound brought here from astonishing distances. In rooms no larger than a modern bedroom, archaeologists have uncovered turquoise by the thousands of pieces, shaped into beads and inlays that caught the desert light. Alongside them lay shell from the Pacific and the Gulf of California, carried hundreds of miles inland through a web of trade that stitched coast to canyon. There were macaw feathers and copper bells from Mesoamerica, vivid reds and metallic chimes that had no local source. This was not a single isolated village in a barren landscape. This was a civilization of genuine complexity, plugged into a continental network of exchange, obligation, and ceremony. At the heart of that ceremonial life lay the kivas, circular, semi-subterranean chambers, some small and intimate, others vast, great kivas sunk deep into the plazas. Their masonry benches ringed the walls, fire pits and sipapus opened in the floor. Massive roof beams once spanned the space above, turning these rooms into enclosed worlds where light, smoke, and sound could be carefully controlled. Here is what makes them so striking. Their design echoes living Pueblo traditions, where kivas anchor stories of emergence, agricultural cycles, and the layered structure of the cosmos. Ritual fires would have flickered against plastered walls. Drums and chants might have risen through roof hatches into the night, timed to planting, to harvest, to the appearance of certain stars. These were not casual gatherings. The architecture itself insists on formality, repetition, and encoded meaning. Above and beyond the kivas, the canyon itself became an observatory. On Fajada Butte, 3 sandstone slabs cast narrow shafts of light across a spiral petroglyph. At solstices and equinoxes, those slivers of light strike the carved lines with uncanny precision, a phenomenon known as the sun dagger. Elsewhere, great houses are oriented toward cardinal directions, or to the extreme positions of the moon during its 18.6-year standstill cycle. No written records, no metal instruments, no telescopes, yet the walls and windows track the sky. Inside those same walls, long rows of storage rooms held maize and other goods. Middens around plazas contained feasting debris, broken serving bowls, animal bones, drinking vessels used in numbers far beyond what a resident population would require. To many researchers, the evidence points toward Chaco as a pilgrimage centre. a regional hub where people converged periodically for trade, alliance-making, and shared ceremony rather than a densely packed city in the modern sense. And yet, within this order, a deeper mystery remains. Who decided when to call the people in? Who controlled the flow of turquoise, the timing of rituals, the meanings of the sky? For generations, researchers have traced matrilineal lineages in burials, measured room sizes, and passed the distribution of prestige goods. But what we are left with is only a shadow of the social structure that once animated these stones. Somewhere between the kivas below and the stars above, authority was justified and power was performed, and the next layer of the mystery emerges when those patterns begin to fracture. Those fractures do not stay abstract. They leave marks in stone and timber. Imagine walking through a great house, not at its triumphant height, but in its last, uneasy century, as the rhythm of construction falters and the canyon's roll begins to dim. Chaco's peak comes into focus between about 1050 and 1130 CE. In that span, masons raise towering walls, roadways extend like ceremonial arteries, and the trade network hums with turquoise, shell, and copper, arriving from distant coasts and mountains. Then, almost imperceptibly at first, the tempo changes. New wings are smaller. Some projects never quite resolve. This was not a single catastrophic collapse. It was a long, uneven unravelling. Archaeologists read this shift in 1,000 quiet details. Rooms that were carefully laid out remain unfinished, their walls only halfway to the planned height. Kivas that once echoed with chanting are intentionally filled in, their entrances sealed as if closing a chapter. Massive timber beams, hauled from forests more than 50 miles away, are pried out and reused in later buildings, a literal recycling of the old order into something leaner, more uncertain. At the same time, the flow of exotic trade goods into the canyon declines. Fewer marine shells, fewer macaw feathers, fewer gleaming ornaments arrive to reaffirm Chaco's centrality. For generations, researchers have turned to climate records for answers. Tree rings from the region show prolonged droughts in the late 1100s, and again in the 1200s, sequences of failed rains that would have strained crops, water storage, and the fragile soils already stressed by centuries of use. Deforestation around the canyon, erosion on slopes, and the sheer demand of feeding thousands in a marginal environment all suggest a landscape pushed close to its limits. Others focus on the human dimension. Resource scarcity can sharpen social tensions. Shifts in religious authority, challenges to lineages, or disputes between great houses and outlying communities may have made the old arrangements harder to sustain. In this reading, the filling of kivas is not just practical, it is ideological. A conscious ending of rituals, a withdrawal of sacred presence from certain rooms and plazas. Here is what makes the mystery so persistent. None of these theories, alone or combined, quite fit the pattern. Some outlying communities continue for generations after the canyon's peak. Others move toward places like Mesa Verde or the Rio Grande, carrying architectural motifs and ceremonial practices that echo Chaco yet are not simple copies. This was a civilization of genuine complexity, capable of reorganizing itself rather than merely falling apart. What you are left with in the end is an image. Great houses standing empty under a changing sky, their doorways dark, their plazas quiet. No written records, no final proclamation, just the sense that a decision was made to walk away from a centuries-long project, whether by consensus, crisis, or revelation. So settle in, because the trail of that decision does not end here. It bends outward into new settlements, new shrines, and new layers of the mystery across the wider southwest. That decision bends toward a very different horizon, away from the open plazas of Chaco and toward a landscape where communities seem to cling to the very edges of the world. Imagine stepping out of dense pinon and juniper onto the lip of a high plateau. The ground falling away into a maze of canyons, sandstone walls glowing gold and red as the sun moves across the sky. Here, in what is now called Mesa Verde, the land is carved into fingers and ravines, deep cuts that hide shadow and water and ancient roots. High above the canyon floor, natural alcoves hollowed into the cliffs become shelves in the stone, narrow ledges that look, at first, too precarious for anything but wind and birds, and yet entire villages are tucked there, suspended between sky and rock, invisible until the angle of a light reveals them. Cliff Palace is the most famous of these places, Under a sweeping overhang of sandstone, walls rise in tight clusters, multi-story rooms of carefully shaped blocks and mortar, tiny doorways, windows watching the canyon. Round, subterranean kivas punctuate the plaza, their low walls and roof openings marking ceremonial spaces that echo older traditions on the mesa tops. Ladders once connected levels, rooms opened into other rooms, passageways turned the whole alcove into a single interlocking organism. This was not a single isolated experiment. Spruce Tree House, Balcony House, Longhouse, and dozens of smaller sites repeat the pattern. Architecture pressed into rock, communities literally built into the cliff face. Here is what makes this shift even more striking. For centuries before the 1100s, ancestral Puebloan families farmed and lived on the broad, flatter mesa tops above, raising corn, beans, and squash, building villages in open air with easy access to fields and springs. Then, in the 12th and 13th centuries, energy and labor poured into these alcoves instead. Stone by stone, beam by beam, people reoriented their daily lives down sheer walls and along narrow ledges. The logistical challenge alone is staggering. Water had to be carried up from canyon springs, food from fields on the mesa tops, timber for roofs, and ladders dragged from distant forests, all moved along steep trails that, even today, demand caution and strength. For generations, researchers have offered theories to explain this choice: defense against raiding in a time of drought and competition, climate adaptation, using the shade and thermal stability of the overhangs to buffer against harsher seasons, spiritual or ceremonial reasons, a deliberate move into liminal spaces where earth and sky meet, turning the cliff itself into a living shrine. The archaeological record hints at all of these but commits to none. Because what you're about to discover is that these elaborate cliff communities were not permanent refugees. Within little more than a century, they were abandoned. Rooms carefully sealed, belongings taken or cached, fires extinguished. What we're left with are empty towers and silent kivas, and a central question that refuses to fade. Why invest so much into cities in the cliffs, only to walk away? The trail of that question will lead beyond Mesa Verde, into wider networks of migration, memory and renewal across the southwest. So, settle in with that image of sealed doorways and darkened hearths, because the next layer of this mystery lies not only in stone, but in tree rings and sky. Imagine holding a cross-section of an ancient pine cut from the high slopes above Mesa Verde. Each narrow band of wood is a year. Wet years swell wide, dry years pinch tight. In the late 1200s, those bands thin, then thin again, then nearly vanish. Dendrochronology, the science of reading those rings, has revealed a series of severe droughts across the four corners at exactly the moment cliff palaces were being emptied. No written records, no chronicles of famine, just this silent archive of stress. Maize, beans, and squash fields depended on carefully managed dryland farming. Without dependable snowmelt and summer rains, harvest after harvest would have failed. This was not a single bad season. This was a grinding, multi-year test of survival. As water and food became uncertain, the very layout of the landscape seems to shift. Researchers see more villages perched on defensible ridges, more towers with commanding views over canyons, more pathways that can be easily watched or blocked. Burned structures appear in the archaeological record, some with signs that the fires were sudden, not ceremonial. Skeletons at a few sites bear trauma that hints at raiding or open conflict. Here is what makes this so striking. A culture that once invested in great houses and open plazas begins to favour hidden alcoves and hard-to-reach ledges. Settlement patterns contract and cluster. Some hamlets are abandoned while others grow more crowded, as if families sought safety in numbers. Defensive walls rise. Entrances narrow. For generations, researchers have debated whether this represents large-scale warfare or a more diffuse atmosphere of insecurity, of neighbours watching neighbours, of alliances fraying under pressure. Climate, in this reading, is not just drought, it is a catalyst for human tension. Yet another current runs through the evidence: religious and cosmological transformation. In the 13th century, ritual architecture changes. Kivas are remodeled or replaced. Iconography on pottery and rock art shifts. with new symbols and beings appearing as older motifs fade. Pilgrimage routes and ceremonial centers seem to realign, pulling communities toward the Rio Grande, the Zuni region, and farther south. This was a civilization of genuine complexity, and spiritual decisions could be as compelling as practical ones. Modern Pueblo oral traditions speak not of a single collapse, but of migrations and cycles of emergence. Communities move when balance with land and spirits is lost, when instructions from the ancestors demand a new place, a new covenant. In that framework, Mesa Verde is not abandoned, it is completed. Its teachings carried away in memory, song, and ceremony. What you're about to discover is that even with climate models, conflict theories, and careful excavation, what we are left with is an incomplete script. Drought, insecurity, and spiritual renewal all played roles, yet the exact conversations that led one family to seal a door and walk toward a distant river remain beyond reach. To trace their path, the story has to widen, because the people leaving these cliffs did not vanish into silence. They stepped into a larger network of villages, roads, and sacred landscapes. And there, another mystery waits. They stepped into that larger network, but the canyons they left behind still watch in silence. Imagine standing in Chaco, then in Mesa Verde, and feeling two very different answers to the same ancient question. How should a people make a home in a sacred landscape? In Chaco Canyon, the answer is written in straight lines and sweeping vistas. Great houses rise from the desert floor, planned with geometric precision, their walls aligned to solstices and lunar standstills. Roads run like ceremonial spokes across the bare plateau, some stretching for miles in unnervingly straight lines. This was not a single village. This was a civilization of genuine complexity, concentrating power, ritual, and trade into a canyon that could never have fed its own population. Mesa Verde answers differently. Here the architecture withdraws into shadow. Cliff dwellings cling to alcoves tucked beneath overhanging rock, rooms stacked and interlocked, kivas sunk deep and enclosed. Instead of broad plazas, there are tight passageways, hidden staircases, defensible ledges. Where Chaco opens itself to the sky, Mesa Verde folds inward, turning sandstone overhangs into stone fortresses and intimate neighborhoods. Here is what makes the mystery sharper. Researchers can map every room, every staircase, every kiva. They can sift hearth ash to reconstruct diets, track corn pollen through soils, follow obsidian and turquoise along trade routes that run from the Rockies to Mesoamerica. They can model rainfall patterns year by year and show how drought bit into harvests and stressed this culture's network of obligations. Yet the inner calculations remain invisible. No transcript of the council where someone argued to stay, no record of the vision that convinced others to leave. The word collapse hangs over both places like a verdict, but it does not quite fit. There was no sudden disappearance into the void, no vanishing race. Descendants of these builders live today in Hopi mesas along Rio Grande pueblos, across Zuni and other communities, carrying forward languages, rituals, and stories that insist these were chapters in a longer journey, not an ending. So settle in with that dissonance. Oral histories speak of migrations, of instructions to move when signs in the land and sky aligned, of obligations to leave places ceremonially complete. Archaeological evidence speaks of drought, resource strain, shifting alliances, new ceremonial centers rising elsewhere. Both streams of knowledge flow through the same canyon, but they do not merge into a single, tidy narrative. Why these sites, in these forms? Why the pivot from open canyon monuments to sheltered cliff strongholds, then away from both? What you're about to discover is that even with living continuity, the timing and drama of these architectural shifts resist one definitive story. What we are left with are stone cities that can be measured to the centimetre, yet cannot tell the full truth of a single family's decision to walk away. Pattern interrupt. Those were cities of stone in a stark desert. The next mystery rises from earth and timber in the humid heartland, once rivaling medieval London in size, then fading so quickly that even its name to outsiders became a question. Imagine driving past gas stations, chain restaurants, and neat rows of houses on the Illinois side of the Mississippi, thinking it is all just another stretch of American suburb, and then realizing that beneath the cornfields around you lies the footprint of a forgotten metropolis. No stone towers, no surviving palaces, just a low horizon broken by strange, grass-covered rises that look, at first glance, like nothing at all. This is Cahokia, a cluster of ancient earthen mounds just east of present-day St. Louis, hemmed in by highways and industrial lots, where an immense city once stood that most outside archaeology have never heard of. Cars rush past on the interstate, freight trains rattle nearby, yet under that modern noise is the echo of tens of thousands of voices, of fires, of drums, of a civilization that reordered the landscape of the American heartland. Between about 1050 and 1200 CE, this was not a single village or ceremonial camp. It was an urban centre on a scale that forces a rethinking of ancient North America. At its height, Cahokia may have held 10,000 to 20,000 people in and around its core, with more in surrounding farmsteads and satellite communities. That population made it comparable to, and perhaps larger than, many European cities of the same era. Imagine medieval London's crowded lanes, then transpose that density into a world of timber, thatch, and sculpted earth. Here is what makes Cahokia visually unforgettable: Monk's Mound. Rising more than 100 feet above the plain, terraced like a stepped pyramid, this massive earthwork dominates a central plaza sprawling across an area the size of multiple football fields. No stone blocks, no mortar, just millions of basket loads of soil carried by human hands, stacked and shaped with astonishing precision. From its summit, leaders once looked out over a gridded landscape of houses, smaller mounds and ceremonial spaces, all keyed to a geometry that is still being mapped. For generations, researchers have traced the reach of this place along the river network that cradled it. From the Mississippi and its tributaries, influence radiated outward in every direction. Shared iconography appears on engraved shell and copper. Distinctive pottery styles echo across distant villages. Mound-building practices and ceremonial layouts recur from the Great Lakes to the Gulf Coast, signaling a Mississippian cultural sphere with Cahokia at its pulsing center, coordinating trade, ritual, and perhaps regional politics. This was a civilization of genuine complexity. Planned neighborhoods, palisades, and causeways. Possible observatories of wood posts aligned to solstices and equinoxes. Evidence of feasting on an enormous scale and of rituals whose full meaning has slipped beyond direct recovery. Yet in the midst of this sophistication, one thing is conspicuously absent. Cahokia left no written records in an alphabetic script. No chronicles of its founding, no royal edicts, no recorded debates over alliance or war. What we are left with are post holes tracing vanished buildings, refuse pits filled with broken pottery and animal bone, burial mounds with carefully arranged offerings, and the silent geometry of earthworks whose angles and orientations hint at cosmology. Researchers can model its growth and debate its abrupt transformation, but the intimate voices of its people remain out of reach. The next mystery lies in what happened when that ordered landscape began to unravel. Imagine walking out of that unraveling landscape and into Cahokia at its height, the air thick with wood smoke and drum beats, the horizon broken not by glass towers but by sculpted earth. Before anything else, the geometry hits first. A vast open plaza stretches before you, an intentional void framed by monumental presence, with Monk's Mound rising at its northern edge like a stepped green pyramid of packed soil and power. This was not a single accidental hill. This was a civilization of genuine complexity, layering basket after basket of earth into a four-terraced platform that once supported a great building, likely a temple or the residence of a paramount leader. Around the plaza, dozens of smaller platform mounds stand in ordered ranks, their flat tops bearing council houses, elite residences, and ceremonial structures. No palace walls, no carved stone columns, no written decrees. What they left instead were earthworks, arranged so precisely that the entire core reads like a planned ceremonial engine. Here is what makes that design even more striking. The city did not stop at the visible mounds. Beneath the surface, post holes and borrow pits reveal repeated episodes of construction, renewal, and reorientation. The plaza itself was carefully leveled and resurfaced over generations, its edges lined by raised platforms that turned open ground into a stage for gatherings, processions, and rites, whose details remain a mystery. The spatial hierarchy is unmistakable. Sacred and political power elevated above, communal life focused in the broad sunlit expanse below. To the west of Monk's Mound, another circle commands attention. Not of stone, but of towering red cedar posts driven deep into the soil. Archaeologists call it Woodhenge. Its posts are aligned so that on solstices and equinoxes the rising sun appears in specific gaps when viewed from a central point. No metal instruments, no written tables, no telescopes, yet the alignments mark a formalized solar calendar, turning the city itself into an observatory that tied ceremonial timing, agricultural cycles, and political authority to the movements of the sky. Beyond this core, dense neighborhoods spread outward in rings. Rectangular thatched houses cluster around courtyards, accompanied by storage pits brimming with maize, squash and beans, and small gardens woven into the urban fabric. Interspersed among them are smaller mounds and segments of palisade, wooden walls that once enclosed portions of the city. The arrangement suggests clear social stratification and organized labor. Elites near the central mounds, specialists and retainers in intermediate zones, commoners at the periphery, all bound into a single living network. In the soil and refuse of these districts, the reach of Cahokia becomes visible. Marine shell carved into intricate ornaments, copper artifacts hammered from Great Lakes metal, chert from distant quarries, and iconography depicting birds of prey, warriors, and mythic beings appear in a shared Mississippian style found across the eastern half of the continent. The evidence points to a far-flung trade network and a sphere of influence that radiated far beyond the Mississippi floodplain. So settle in with that image for a moment. Modern surveys, magnetometry, and excavations reveal a city aligned to cardinal directions, layered through time and symbolically charged in its every axis. This was not a haphazard aggregation of villages, it was a deliberate cosmological statement built in earth and wood. What you're about to discover next is how such an ordered world could rise so quickly, and how its sudden transformation still troubles researchers trying to understand its ultimate collapse. Imagine standing on the central plaza at Cahokia around the year 1050. The air is thick with smoke from cooking fires, the sound of drums rolls across the floodplain, and everywhere, people are moving baskets of earth. In a human lifetime, a quiet cluster of villages is erupting into a metropolis. Archaeologists call this moment the Big Bang. In just a few decades, construction around the Great Central Pyramid, now known as Monk's Mound, accelerates at a staggering pace. New plazas are leveled. Dozens of platform mounds rise in carefully ordered rows. Population surges as families stream in from surrounding valleys, until perhaps 10,000 to 20,000 people live in and around this complex of earthworks. This was not a single ceremonial outpost. This was a civilization of genuine complexity anchored in the Mississippi heartland. Here is what makes this transformation even more striking. The growth of Cahokia is not only visible in soil and timber, it is written in feasts, rituals, and stress. Excavations reveal huge middens packed with animal bones and broken serving vessels, traces of large-scale gatherings where elites may have consolidated power through generosity and spectacle. Nearby, carefully arranged deposits of shells, stone tools, and exotic minerals hint at ceremonial offerings. In some mounds there is darker evidence, tightly grouped burials that many researchers interpret as human sacrifice, perhaps to sanctify new constructions or legitimize rulers. As the city expands, its defenses harden. A massive wooden palisade studded with bastions encircles the central precinct. It is not built once and forgotten. It is rebuilt again and again, 4, maybe 5 times, each iteration leaving post holes like scars in the ground. No written records, no clear explanation, just the unmistakable signal that leaders expected danger, whether from outside enemies or internal unrest. After around 1200, the arc bends downward. Monument building slows, some neighborhoods thin out. Climate records from tree rings and lake sediments point to episodes of drought and sudden flooding along the Mississippi, stressing crops and storage. At the same time, deforestation for fuel and construction likely stripped nearby hillsides, leading to erosion and exhausted soils. Some researchers point to internal conflict, others to political fragmentation as outlying communities pull away from Cahokia's orbit. These are compelling theories, none fully resolves the mystery of its collapse. By the time Europeans entered the region centuries later, the wooden palisades had rotted, the great houses had vanished, and the mounds lay overgrown with trees. The name Cahokia itself comes from a later Illini-speaking group. Whatever the city once called itself is absent from written history, even as descendant communities endured and adapted across the Midwest and South. So settle in, because what you're about to discover is not a neat rise and fall parable. Environmental strain, resource depletion, and social upheaval all played their parts, yet the exact sequence, the reason this urban experiment fled so brilliantly and then ceded its primacy within a few generations, remains only partially explained. What we are left with is a metropolis that seems to appear almost out of nowhere, dominates a continental network of trade and ceremony, and then fades, leaving behind silent earthworks and an uncomfortable question. If a centre this powerful can transform so quickly, what else might be missing from the story of ancient America that has yet to surface from the ground? So settle in with that question hanging in the air, because Cahokia forces a different way of seeing. Imagine standing on the summit of Monk's Mound, not looking at grand stone ruins, but at an open field where almost everything that mattered has rotted back into the soil. No carved chronicles, no palace walls, no libraries of clay or bark. What researchers are left with are stains in the ground, and absences where power once stood. Here is what makes Cahokia so challenging. Its story is reconstructed not from towering monuments of stone, but from post-hole patterns, soil chemistry, and the ghostly traces of long-vanished buildings. Archaeologists read arcs of dark circles as the outlines of massive council houses. They follow lines of discoloration that reveal palisades, watchtowers, and ceremonial plazas. They map phosphate-rich soil where generations walked, cooked, and discarded food, tracing neighborhoods from invisible gradients in the earth. In this city, the negative space speaks. Rows of post holes show where great timber temples rose and fell. Clean, carefully maintained plazas appear as broad, artifact-poor rectangles surrounded by dense debris, signaling places of ritual, not residence. Even the distribution of broken pots, deer bones, and exotic trade goods becomes a kind of script, hinting at feasts, processions, and zones of restricted access inside an ancient urban maze. Yet when those patterns are assembled, the political picture refuses to sit still. Was Cahokia a centralized state, ruled from the top of Monk's Mound by a single paramount leader? Was it a theocratic chiefdom, where religious authority and political control fused in a small circle of ritual specialists? Or was it a looser network of powerful neighborhoods and allied communities, coordinated through ceremony rather than through a rigid bureaucracy that mirrors old-world empires? For generations, researchers have argued over where Cahokia belongs on charts of social evolution. Some see ranked classes, strict hierarchy, and coercive labor, pointing to stockades, mass burials, and monumental earthworks as evidence of centralized command. Others emphasize fluid alliances, ritual obligation, and the persuasive power of shared cosmology. This was not a single, simple village that grew by accident. This was a civilization of genuine complexity that may not fit neatly into any imported category. The unresolved questions run deeper than labels. The identities and roles of Cahokia's leaders remain obscure. Were they divine kings, ancestral mediators, or stewards of seasonal ceremonies? How was social control maintained in such a dense, ritualized environment where thousands gathered for feasts, games, and sky-aligned events? Did ordinary people feel awe, fear, belonging, or fatigue as processions wound through the plazas beneath towering mounds? Pattern interrupt. What if the clearest voices are the hardest to tie down? Across the broader region, indigenous oral traditions speak of great towns, migrations, floods, fires, and transformative moments when worlds were remade. There are stories of sacred centers where people gathered from far away, of leaders who lost balance, of communities who chose to disperse rather than endure imbalance. Yet direct, named references that align cleanly with the archaeological construct called Cahokia remain elusive. What we are left with is a city whose streets can be mapped, but whose inner logic stays just beyond reach. Every mound, every plaza, every line of post holes is visible in plan, yet the fears, hopes, and reasons for walking away remain largely silent. And Cahokia is not alone in that silence. As the camera leaves these Midwestern earthworks and turns toward other abandoned centers of the ancient American landscape, the same question follows. How do civilizations decide that the age of their greatest cities is over? Imagine leaving those great wooden palisades and earthen pyramids behind and stepping into a different kind of monument. No towering mounds, no gridded plazas, just cliffs and canyons whose very skin has been written on. As if, when the age of cities quieted, another register of memory rose into view, the camera drifts west, over the high plains and desert, into the broken mesas of Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, and Colorado. Here, sandstone walls, basalt boulders, and shallow rock shelters are layered with images that have endured not for centuries, but in some cases for millennia. Lines pecked into desert varnish, ochre silhouettes fading but still visible against pale stone. These are not ruins of architecture, these are messages in stone. Researchers draw a careful distinction. Petroglyphs are carved, pecked, or incised into the rock surface, chipping away the dark patina to reveal lighter stone beneath. Pictographs are painted on, using mineral pigments and organic binders that somehow survive wind, rain, and heat. Both appear across the southwest in overlapping waves of style and technique, marking the presence of archaic hunter-gatherers, basket-maker communities, ancestral Puebloan towns, Fremont farmers, and later cultures that moved through or called these places home. Here is what makes these panels so haunting. This was not a single artistic tradition frozen in time. This was a civilization of genuine complexity expressed across rock faces, with new motifs added, older ones respected or reworked, and entire cliff faces becoming palimpsests of vision and memory. At places like Newspaper Rock in Utah, or Petroglyph National Monument in New Mexico, thousands of figures crowd together, layered by generations who return to the same surfaces again and again. Spirals curl inward and outward, sometimes alone, sometimes in clusters. Bighorn sheep, deer, and birds stand beside human-like forms with outstretched arms, headdresses, or radiating lines. Hands appear as crisp outlines or solid silhouettes, as if someone pressed a palm against the stone and insisted on being counted. Geometric grids, ladders, meanders, and angular designs fill empty space, while other marks refuse easy categorization, hovering between abstraction and representation. Some images hint at functions that feel almost familiar. Hunting scenes with bows and animals may reference successful kills or desired abundance. Certain symbols, repeated near springs or in sheltered alcoves, have been linked by descendant communities to fertility, water, or clan identity. There is ceremonial weight here, grounded in living oral traditions that continue to interpret and protect these places. Yet other panels suggest more intricate, even astronomical intentions. At sites like Chaco Canyon and around the Parowan Gap, spirals and notches interact with shafts of sunlight and shadow on solstices and equinoxes, turning bare rock into a working calendar. A famous pictograph near Chaco appears to show a starburst, crescent moon, and handprint together, often associated with a supernova recorded in 1054 CE. For generations, researchers have debated whether such images encode sky events, migration histories, or cosmological journeys mapped onto the canyon walls themselves. So settle in with the tension that lives here. These figures were meant to be seen, revisited, read in ways that once felt as clear as spoken language. Yet the full grammar of that language has slipped partially out of reach. What we are left with are hints and alignments, echoes and living interpretations, and the unsettling awareness that entire systems of meaning can endure in plain sight, while remaining only partly understood. As the camera lingers on a spiral catching the last light of day, another question emerges. What happens when the rock art is not on a wall at all, but woven into the very shape of the land itself? Imagine standing before a sandstone wall in the desert southwest, the surface crowded with ancient figures, when one small pairing suddenly pulls everything into focus, a bright star-like burst carved right beside a thin crescent moon. No written caption, no date, just that pairing, frozen in stone. For generations, researchers have looked at this panel and asked whether it records one of the most dramatic celestial events in human history. In 1054, Chinese and Japanese court astronomers noted a guest star so bright it was visible in daylight for weeks. Modern astrophysics has traced that event to the Crab Nebula, the expanding remnant of a titanic supernova. Theories emerged that this southwestern carving, with its radiant star and crescent, might be a direct observation of that same explosion. The orientation of the moon matches how the sky would have appeared just before dawn. The date of nearby habitation matches the event. Here is what makes this possibility so striking. It suggests that an indigenous observer watched the sky flare open and chose to record it in a permanent ceremonial archive. That panel is not alone. Across the southwest and Great Basin, other petroglyphs appear to capture the sky in crisis. Circles with radiating lines suddenly darkened at the center. Rings around a central disk, with human figures nearby raising their arms. Some researchers argue these are not abstract symbols, but renderings of solar eclipses, moments when day turned to unnatural twilight. By mapping the positions of these carvings and comparing them to reconstructed eclipse paths, correlations begin to emerge, a glyph aligned toward the horizon where the eclipse sun would have set. Another placed at a vantage point where a total eclipse passed directly overhead centuries ago. No palace walls, no throne rooms, just rock, light, and memory. Then there are the spirals. Simple at first glance. Anything but simple in context. Some are carved where a narrow shaft of sunlight or shadow touches them only on solstices or equinoxes, marking the sun's annual path with uncanny precision. Others appear in clusters, different sizes and directions, echoing the movement of celestial bodies or the cycles of Venus and the moon. Ethnographic accounts from Pueblo and other cultures speak of spirals as journeys, as pathways, as the turning of time itself. This was not a single artistic flourish. This was a civilization of genuine complexity, embedding cosmology into stone. To test these ideas, archaeoastronomers now bring a different toolkit: software that rewinds the sky to any date in the past. Careful measurements of local horizons and sightlines. Simulations that show exactly where the sun, moon, and bright stars would have appeared when a panel was fresh. When a carved star aligns with the known position of the 1054 supernova, when an eclipse glyph faces the precise track of totality, the probability of coincidence shrinks, yet not every match convinces. Some circles may be shields, not suns. Some spirals may be trails, not orbits. What we are left with is a delicate balance between compelling evidence and the danger of reading modern expectations into ancient imagery. So settle in, because as the camera pulls back from these carved star maps, the question deepens. What happens when the sky itself is written not just on rock walls, but into the bodies of earthworks that stretch for hundreds of feet across the land? From those sky-written alignments, the camera drops back down to the canyon walls. Imagine standing inches from a panel where spirals, horned figures, and animal shapes all crowd into the same slab of sandstone. No clear beginning, no obvious end, just layers. Because here is what makes southwestern rock art so elusive. Much of it is not a single message from a single moment in time, but a palimpsest built up over centuries. For generations, researchers have traced how one culture after another returned to favoured cliffs and boulders, adding new images beside, between, and directly over older ones. A basket-maker-era bighorn sheep might share space with a later Pueblo-style Katsina figure, and an even later Navajo ceremonial motif. The result looks like a single composition, but the authorship is actually a network of hands and histories. Which image belongs to which community? Which line completes which story? The more closely the surface is studied, the more those questions multiply. The challenge grows sharper when the figures themselves are abstract. Concentric circles, keyhole shapes, gridded rectangles, and elongated mask-like faces appear again and again across the desert. Without a written key or direct ethnographic continuity, their meanings are difficult to fix. Some symbols were likely tied to hunting success, rainfall, or sky events. Others may have encoded clan identities, migration routes, or ceremonial obligations. And some, elders suggest, were never meant for broad audiences at all, but for initiated eyes only. That possibility changes the tone of interpretation. These are not random doodles, they are the visual residue of ancient thought worlds. In many indigenous philosophies, knowledge is tiered. Certain stories are public, others are seasonal, others are gendered or clan-specific, and some are tightly restricted to ceremonial specialists. If those systems guided what was carved or painted, then outsiders staring at the rock face are not just missing context. They are deliberately kept at the edge of the conversation. Mainstream scholars have grown cautious in response. Yes, some motifs can be linked with reasonable confidence to known Pueblo, Navajo, Hopi, Zuni, or Apache symbol systems. A cornstalk here, a cloud terrace there, a familiar lightning bolt or rainbow guardian. Yet just inches away, another figure resists decoding, and multiple plausible theories sit side by side without a clear winner. No single reading feels complete. What we are left with is a spectrum of likelihood, not a solved code. That uncertainty is reinforced by living communities themselves. Some tribes explicitly request that certain panels not be photographed, replicated, or publicly interpreted, emphasizing that these images are still active, still sacred. Researchers, in turn, are reminded that not all evidence is meant for universal consumption, and that respect sometimes means stepping back from the most tantalizing questions. So settle in, because this is where the mystery sharpens into a boundary. The rock remembers. It holds traces of ceremony, migration, and vision, but it also guards silences that may never be breached. As the camera lingers on a maze of lines disappearing into shadow, another possibility rises on the horizon. What happens when the images are not on stone at all, but woven into landscapes so large they can only be seen from above? From those sky-drawn images, the camera drops, plunging toward water. Imagine standing on a wind-scoured ledge above Lake Superior, the horizon a hard line of steel grey, the air sharp with the smell of cold rock and deep thyme. Below, waves slam against sheer cliffs, but inland, the violence gives way to something quieter. Pits, thousands of them, silent hollows in the earth that hint at a different kind of excavation. Here, on Isle Royale and along the Keweenaw Peninsula, the bedrock itself is scarred, not by glaciers, by hands. Hammerstones lie scattered near moss-rimmed depressions, their surfaces pecked and bruised from repeated blows. In some places, narrow trenches snake along copper-bearing veins, their walls still showing tool marks where ancient miners chased metal through stone. This was not a single expedition, not a brief episode of curiosity. The landscape speaks of generations returning to the same outcrops, season after season, year after year. So settle in, because what you're about to discover does not fit the old picture of small, isolated bands casually gathering what the land offered. In waterlogged shafts preserved by cold and the absence of oxygen, researchers have recovered wooden tools, levers, cribbing, remnants of scaffolding. Stone mauls by the tens of thousands have been catalogued, some weighing more than a human head, their grips worn smooth. Mine pits now stand partially collapsed or flooded, yet their regularity, their repeated spacing, their alignment with known copper lodes all point to systematic extraction rather than chance discovery. For generations, researchers have tried to reckon with the scale. Some estimates suggest that, over millennia, enormous quantities of native copper were removed from these Great Lakes mines. Not flakes or incidental nodules, but massive chunks, in some cases hundreds of pounds at a time, pried from the bedrock and hauled away. No written records, no account books, no names. Only absence where metal once lay. Across the eastern woodlands, the evidence of that metal does appear. Blades and awls, beads and pendants, thin sheets hammered into ornaments that moved along trade routes stretching from the Great Lakes to the Ohio Valley, from river valleys into the far reaches of the interior. Copper from this region turns up in burial mounds, in ceremonial caches, in everyday tools that hint at a network of exchange far older than later earthworks and cities. And yet here is what makes this landscape so unsettling. The known artifacts do not seem to match the inferred volume of copper taken from the ground. Even allowing for recycling, for loss, for the quiet decay of centuries, there remains a gap. A missing ledger of metal. If so much copper was carried away, where did it all go? Was there a scale of trade? A sphere of interaction, a use for this metal that has not yet come into focus in the archaeological record. What we are left with is a shoreline of questions, and the sense that beneath the waves of Lake Superior, another chapter of this ancient civilization of genuine complexity still waits, just out of sight, before the story turns toward other great works raised not from mines, but from living Earth itself. So settle in, because before the mystery can deepen, the known story of this ancient metal has to take shape. The copper of the Great Lakes does not only live in abandoned pits and wave-worn boulders, It lives in the small, precise objects that archaeologists keep finding in graves, in village floors, in caches carefully hidden away and never reclaimed. Imagine a burial opened along a quiet river in what is now Wisconsin or Ontario. There, beside a carefully arranged body, lies a narrow awl, hammered from native copper, its tip still sharp after thousands of years. Nearby, a delicate fishhook, a leaf-shaped spear point, a flat knife with smoothed edges, bracelets curled to fit a wrist, beads, pendants, and small spirals that once flashed in firelight. These are not random scraps. They're part of a consistent toolkit and ornament tradition spread across the Great Lakes and far beyond. Here is what makes these artifacts especially powerful as evidence. Copper is not anonymous. When metallurgists analyze trace elements and isotopic signatures, they can often match a finished object to its geological birthplace. Again and again, spear points and ornaments excavated in places like Ohio, Illinois, even the Mississippi Valley, carry the chemical fingerprint of Lake Superior and the Quinault Peninsula. This is not a single local economy. This is a network. No caravans of wagons, no pack animals, no written contracts. Yet copper travelled hundreds, sometimes over 1,000 miles, moving from hand to hand through alliances, marriages, ceremonial exchanges, and long-distance journeys by canoe and footpath. Awls from northern shores end up in Hopewell earthworks. Beads from Great Lakes veins appear in burials linked to cultures far to the south. For generations, researchers have traced these pathways, slowly revealing a continent-spanning web of interaction. Technologically, the tradition is both modest and profound. The copper was usually worked cold, hammered into shape on stone anvils, then annealed in small fires and hammered again. No great furnaces, no large-scale smelting to separate metal from ore. Yet the control was exquisite. Thin blades, recurved hooks, coiled bracelets show a deep empirical understanding of how this native metal bends, hardens, and softens with heat. In pre-contact North America, this was a civilization of genuine complexity and metalworking, even without the bronze and iron that transformed other parts of the world. At the mines themselves, the scale remained striking, but mainstream archaeologists urge caution. Early reports spoke of millions of tons of missing copper, extrapolating from scattered pits and spoil heaps. Modern surveys point out that erosion has erased many clues, that only portions of mining districts have been mapped, and that 19th century observers often overestimated volumes. The truth is still substantial, but likely smaller than the most dramatic theories suggest. Yet even within conservative estimates, the picture is impressive. Thousands of artifacts, mapped trade routes, and overlapping ceremonial centers already testify to an organized, enduring exchange system that tied distant cultures together. What you're about to discover is how those same networks intersected with earthworks, mounds, and monumental landscapes, where copper was only one thread in a far larger design of power, belief, and memory. Yet even that intricate web of exchange leaves one unsettling problem hanging in the air. Around the Great Lakes, the scars of extraction are immense. Miles of trenches on Isle Royale and the Quinault Peninsula, thousands of ancient pits, hammerstones scattered like fossilized echoes of labor. The mystery is simple to state and hard to escape. Where did all that copper go? Imagine standing on a wind-scoured cliff above Lake Superior, looking down at those abandoned workings. For generations, researchers have walked these same ledges, tracing broken veins of ore and counting the tons that must have been removed. Some have looked at the numbers and proposed a dramatic answer, that vast quantities of North American copper were carried across the Atlantic, feeding the bronze industries of the Old World, linking this landscape to the rise of distant kingdoms. In these fringe theories, sleek Bronze Age ships glide into hidden harbours, their hulls heavy with metal. A secret trade network ties the Great Lakes to the Mediterranean, to Mycenaean palaces and Egyptian courts. This was not a single expedition. This was a civilization of genuine complexity, the argument goes, quietly plugged into a global economy thousands of years before the age of sail. Here is what makes that story compelling. It explains the scale of the mining. It flatters the imagination with forbidden maps and lost routes. It even folds the Great Lakes into a grand narrative of ancient civilization, where every unexplained gap becomes a doorway to transoceanic contact. But step back into the discipline of archaeology and the picture changes. Old World bronze can be chemically traced to mines in Cyprus, the Alps, the Balkans and other nearer sources. No shipwrecks bearing unmistakable Great Lakes copper have been found in Atlantic or Mediterranean waters. No clear genetic signatures, no shared writing systems, no matching ceremonial earthworks or tool traditions bridge the oceanic divide. The evidence for such contact is, at best, fragmentary, at worst, non-existent. Most researchers therefore reject the idea of a sustained Bronze Age copper corridor between North America and Europe. Yet that does not dissolve the mystery. Even within mainstream scholarship, questions linger about the intensity, duration, and organization of extraction around Lake Superior. Were these seasonal ventures by small kin groups, or coordinated campaigns directed by regional leaders, drawing on far-flung allies through trade and marriage? More grounded puzzles remain. Perhaps large ritual deposits of copper lie undiscovered beneath lake levels that have shifted since antiquity, or under later village sites and mounds that have not been fully excavated. Perhaps copper was worked into perishable bindings, ceremonial fittings, or wooden effigies that rotted away, leaving only ghost patterns in the soil. Future underwater surveys, sonar sweeps of drowned shorelines, and remote sensing passes over dense forest may yet reveal caches, workshops, or transport routes that change the scale of what is known. So settle in with that tension. Sensational answers are not supported, yet the mines themselves refuse to shrink into a minor footnote. What you are left with is a partially told story of industry, trade, and value in ancient North America, a story that leads from glittering nuggets on Superior's shores toward the next great landscape of mystery, the monumental earthworks where power, memory, and metal converged. From the copper shores of Superior, the trail does not end, it widens. Those glittering nuggets of ancient industry echo the same impulse that shaped a 300-foot earthen serpent in Ohio, raised great houses in the desert, stacked pyramidal mounds by the Mississippi, carved spirals into canyon walls, and tunneled deep into bedrock in search of metal and meaning. Imagine lifting above the continent, watching these places flare into view like constellations on the land. Serpent Mound curling along its ridge, Chaco Canyon's great houses locked to solstice light, Mesa Verde's cliff dwellings tucked under sandstone overhangs, Cahokia's towering Monk's Mound dominating the floodplain, rock art panels scattered across the southwest, Great Lakes mines pocked along the shoreline. This was not a single site or a single moment. This was a civilization of genuine complexity, expressed in many languages of stone, soil, and symbol. Here is what makes them feel related, even across thousands of miles. In each case, people invested monumental effort into things that were not merely practical. Serpent Mound does not store grain. Chaco's great kivas do not defend a border. The cliff palaces of Mesa Verde are more than shelter. Cahokia's earthworks are not simple foundations. The petroglyph fields do not plough a single furrow. The copper pits do not feed a village, yet all demanded generations of labour, coordination, and ceremony. Across them all, the sky is a constant companion. Serpent Mound aligns with solstices and lunar events. Chaco's walls frame the rising and setting sun. Mesa Verde's niches catch light on key days. Southwestern rock art appears to record eclipses and even a supernova. Cahokia's wood-henge circles track the solar year. These were observatories built without telescopes, calendars inscribed into earthworks and cliff faces. Threaded through is trade, Chaco's timber hauled from distant mountains. Cahokia's plazas filled with shells, copper and exotic stone. Great Lakes copper moving outward along invisible routes. Pigments, ideas, and ceremonial objects crossing cultural boundaries, binding distant regions into a network that does not fit old stereotypes of isolated tribes. And then, the pattern of change. Chaco's great houses fall silent, Mesa Verde's alcoves empty. Cahokia's population thins and scatters. Some rock art traditions fade, others shift. The copper mines quiet long before European arrival. For generations, researchers have charted timelines, climate shifts, and social pressures, outlining the how of construction and abandonment with increasing precision. Yet the why remains partly veiled. Part of that veil is absence. No alphabetic chronicles describing a ruler's decree. No diaries explaining a vision that demanded a serpent of earth. Only rare glyphic systems, the selective survival of oral traditions, and landscapes that remember without speaking. What we are left with is a chorus of possible narratives, from mainstream theories of drought, disease, and political fracture, to more speculative ideas about prophecy, cosmology, and deliberate transformation. So settle in. The tour of stones, mounds, and mines has set the stage. What you're about to discover next is not just how these civilizations changed, moved, or let certain practices fade, but the competing worlds of explanation that try to make sense of that change, and the unsettling possibility that the most important choice they made is the one least visible in the archaeological record. Imagine the sky darkening over Chaco Canyon, not with storm clouds, but with a drought that simply does not end. Year after year, the tree rings in ancient junipers narrow to thin, desperate bands. No written records, no royal decrees, just the silent testimony of wood and mud and dust. For generations, researchers have turned to that silent testimony to ask whether climate itself helped push these civilizations toward transformation. Dendrochronology, the science of reading tree rings, becomes a kind of archive. In the beams of Chaco's great houses, in the rafters of Mesa Verde's cliff dwellings, in long-lived pines across the Four Corners, patterns emerge. Severe drought gripping the late 1100s, and again in the late 1200s. Lake sediment cores from nearby basins add another layer, capturing pollen shifts, ash, and changes in erosion that trace flooding and long dry spells over centuries. Together, they sketch a climate that was not stable, but restless. Now shift to the Mississippi bottomlands around Cahokia. Here, sediment cores pulled from oxbow lakes and abandoned channels show a different kind of stress. Flood layers stacked one atop another, evidence of the river jumping its banks, reworking fields, drowning maize, and then retreating to leave behind raw, eroded ground. Temperature reconstructions hint at regional cooling after centuries of warmth, compressing growing seasons just as populations were peaking. This was not a single bad harvest. This was a civilization of genuine complexity pressed against its environmental limits. Here is what makes those limits so crucial: carrying capacity. Every landscape can only support so many people, so many fields, so many ceremonial centers before the margin for error vanishes. At Chaco, deforestation for timber and fuel stripped nearby slopes, increasing erosion and making each drought more punishing. Around Mesa Verde, intensive farming on fragile soils left terraces vulnerable once the rains faltered. Near Cahokia, clearing forests for earthworks, houses and fields, hunting game for a dense urban population, and fishing the surrounding wetlands all pushed the region toward maximum load. Deforestation, soil exhaustion, overhunting, overfishing. None of these alone guarantees collapse. Yet together, in a climate that swings between extremes, they reduce resilience. When the late 1200s megadrought hits the southwest, communities that have already thinned forests and stretched water sources must make hard choices: move, reorganize, or endure hunger. When major floods sweep the Mississippi corridor, a city built among mounds and causeways suddenly finds its carefully managed landscape turned unpredictable. Still, climate and ecology are not puppeteers pulling invisible strings. Environmental stress does not automatically lead to collapse. Human decisions, social hierarchies, ceremonial obligations, and values about land and kin all mediate the response. Some pueblos consolidate, some disperse into smaller villages, some reorient trade networks rather than vanish. What you're about to discover in later theories is how warfare, ideology, and external contact intersect with that environmental backdrop. So settle in. The tree rings, the lake mud, the eroded hillsides give powerful evidence, but they do not tell a simple, deterministic story. What we are left with is a larger web of causes in which climate is crucial, yet never alone. A shifting stage upon which ancient cultures chose, resisted, adapted, and sometimes walked away from the very landscapes that had sustained them for centuries. If climate is the shifting stage, power and belief are the actors moving across it. Imagine a city like Cahokia at its height, tens of thousands of people clustered around towering mounds and broad plazas, a ceremonial and political center pulsing with obligation, tribute, and ritual. This was not a single village. This was a civilization of genuine complexity, layered with leaders, specialists, farmers, and pilgrims drawn in from a vast surrounding landscape. As any ancient civilization grows, so do its fault lines. Inequalities deepen, rival factions maneuver, and authority must be constantly renewed, displayed, defended. Researchers point to this quiet pressure building inside places like Cahokia and Chaco Canyon. No written records, no royal chronicles, no decrees of conquest. What they left instead were earthworks, great houses, and a scattered trail of clues that hint at internal strain. Here is what makes the archaeological record so haunting. In the American bottom near Cahokia, palisade walls are rebuilt again and again, gates narrowed, bastions strengthened. At some burned compounds, charred posts and collapsed roofs speak of fire that was not accidental. In the southwest, towers appear on mesa edges, villages tuck into cliff alcoves, and defensive positioning becomes more pronounced through time. These are not the choices of communities at ease. Beneath the ground, the story shifts in more intimate ways. Earlier burials at Cahokia emphasize certain lineages and high-status individuals, sometimes accompanied by rich offerings and symbolic artifacts. Later, those patterns fragment. New arrangements, new emphasis, perhaps new ideas about who deserved honor in death. In Chaco and later Pueblo regions, iconography on pottery and rock art evolves. Masked beings, Katsina-like figures, warfare motifs, and images that some see as warnings or records of turmoil. Theories multiply, but a consistent theme emerges. Something in the ideological fabric was being rewoven. For generations, researchers have listened closely to Pueblo oral histories that speak of migrations, of leaving places when obligations were no longer balanced, when ceremonies were no longer held in the right way, when leaders failed in their responsibilities. In some traditions, prophetic figures urge communities to move, to abandon great houses and plazas, to seek new homes where relationships with the spirit world and with neighboring groups can be renewed. The departure is not always framed as collapse. It is framed as instruction. From this perspective, the emptying of monumental centers takes on a different light. People at Mesa Verde, at Chaco, even around the shadow of Monk's Mound, may have been reconfiguring their identities and alliances, folding old symbols into new regional networks. A plaza that once anchored a region's ceremonial calendar might simply have completed its role within a living tradition, not failure, fulfillment, followed by departure. Yet these social explanations remain interpretive, not definitive. No chronicles, no signed testimonies, no single voice to settle the debate. What we are left with are patterns, analogies, and echoes between archaeology and living memory, always powerful, never absolute. And just beyond these human dramas of power and belief lies another layer of mystery. The possibility that some alignments, some symbols, were tuned not only to politics, but to the movements of the stars themselves. So, settle in with that thought of stars and stone, because this is where the mystery presses hardest against the edges of what archaeology can comfortably explain. Environmental models, social models, ritual models, each one powerful, each one illuminating part of the picture, yet none of them quite dissolves the questions that cling to these ancient landscapes. Take Serpent Mound in Ohio. A 1,300-foot earthen snake, coiled across a ridge, its open mouth framing the setting sun at the solstice, its curves echoing lunar standstills. Researchers can measure every contour, model every alignment, compare soils and dates. But the core questions linger. Why this exact ridge? Why this particular animal, stretched to this impossible scale, in a region filled with other earthworks that chose circles, squares, and octagons instead? The same tension runs through Chaco Canyon and Mesa Verde. Climate records, tree rings, and midden heaps reveal drought, resource strain, and shifting trade. There is evidence for social stress, for new defensive architecture, for migration. Yet even when the theories line up with the timing of the so-called collapse, they do not fully answer why people invested centuries in such harsh places to begin with, or why entire communities walked away while related groups elsewhere adapted and endured. Cahokia raises the stakes further. Here is what makes that city so unsettling for modern assumptions. This was a civilization of genuine complexity, with towering platform mounds, vast plazas, a wooden solar calendar, and a dense network of trade radiating from the Mississippi heartland. Environmental stress, political upheaval, disease, all have been proposed to explain its decline. But none quite explains the speed of its unravelling, or why its specific blend of symbols and ceremonial power did not simply reappear intact somewhere else. Within mainstream archaeology, these are not disagreements between science and fantasy. They are debates inside the house of evidence itself. Some researchers emphasize climate cycles and crop failures. Others foreground social hierarchy, factional rivalry, and the strains of managing large populations. Still others point to ideology and ritual, arguing that when a ceremonial order loses its meaning, the entire built world around it can be abandoned like a husk. Imagine, then, that the remaining mystery is not only about missing data, but about mismatched frameworks. The people who carved star maps into canyon walls, who mined copper on Isle Royale far beyond what surviving artifacts explain, who traced serpents and circles in earth were not simply early versions of modern minds. Their categories of sacred and practical, of self and landscape, may not map cleanly onto modern theories at all. What you're about to discover in the next segments are the more speculative attempts to close that gap. Epidemics and spiritual crises, deliberate withdrawals from corrupted centres, and more exotic claims that stray toward lost technologies and vanished continents. Some rest on thin evidence, some on intriguing but incomplete clues. What we are left with, at this threshold, is a disturbing possibility that the most unsettling answers may lie not in miracles of engineering, but in choices made for reasons modern observers may never fully share or fully understand. So settle in, because there is another possibility that lingers at the edge of the record. Not a war, not a drought, an enemy that leaves almost nothing visible behind. Imagine entire communities shaken not by invading armies, but by fevers, rashes, and sudden deaths whose causes no one could see. For generations, researchers have asked whether epidemic disease might have swept through parts of North America long before European pathogens like smallpox and measles transformed the continent, not imported from overseas, but rising within regional ecologies themselves. Zoonotic illnesses jumping from rodents, birds or deer into human populations. Infections flaring along river valleys, through dense towns, across ceremonial landscapes that pulsed with gatherings, feasts and trade. Here is what makes this theory both compelling and elusive. In principle, it fits what is known about human societies everywhere. Dense settlements, long-distance networks, and stored food create ideal conditions for outbreaks. Cahokia, with tens of thousands of people clustered around towering earthworks and plazas. Chaco Canyon, drawing visitors from hundreds of miles away into great houses and kivas. This was not a single isolated village here and another there. In key eras, this was a civilization of genuine complexity, linked by roads, rivers and obligations. Yet when researchers look for direct evidence of large-scale pre-contact epidemics, the trail blurs. Skeletons rarely display unmistakable signs of acute infectious disease. Bone changes are ambiguous, easily confused with malnutrition, injury or long-term stress. Ancient DNA can sometimes detect pathogen fragments, but preservation is uneven, and genomic studies remain in early stages for many regions. No clear layer of graves, no mass burial trench shouting the story of one catastrophic wave. The pattern interrupt comes here. Imagine a disease that never becomes a continental pandemic. Instead, it burns through a single valley, a cluster of towns, a key ceremonial center. It kills a ruler, a lineage of priests, the traders who hold a fragile alliance together. No monumental ruin, no obvious signature in the soil, just a sudden vacuum in leadership, a break in ritual, a gap in the network that once moved copper, shells, and stories from the Great Lakes to the Gulf. Even localized outbreaks could have been understood as spiritual crises rather than biological events. A plague might signal that ancestral powers were offended, that a sacred alignment had been broken, that a place itself had turned dangerous. Communities might respond by abandoning plazas, closing shrines, or migrating away from earthworks and canyon cities that had defined their world for centuries. And yet, the careful caveat remains. So far, no site-specific dataset cleanly ties a disease event to the decline of Cahokia, to the depopulation of Chaco, or to the fading of other ancient centers. The scenario is plausible, it resonates with global history. But without clear signatures in bones, sediments, or DNA, it stays in the realm of informed speculation. What you're about to discover, in this tension, is one of the deep challenges of studying the ancient Americas. Some gaps in the record invite explanations that cannot easily be confirmed or dismissed. They hover between probability and proof. What we are left with is a landscape where climate, politics, belief, and perhaps invisible enemies all compete as possible causes. A landscape of partial answers, feeding the enduring mystery of why so many great places rose, transformed, and then fell silent. From that silence, another question emerges. If disease is hard to see, what about the changes that can still be traced in the very architecture of ritual and power? From that silence, another question emerges. If disease is hard to see, what about the changes that can still be traced in the very architecture of ritual and power? Imagine standing in the shadow of a great house at Chaco Canyon, its walls still catching the same desert light that once fell on crowded plazas and echoing kivas. No smoke, no voices, just the sense that a decision was made here, a decision to leave. In many indigenous philosophies, that choice is not an aberration, it is a pattern. This was not a single break, but part of a long rhythm of emergence, migration and renewal, in which communities moved to maintain balance with land and sky. Among Pueblo peoples, stories describe ancestors emerging into successive worlds, travelling along sacred routes and settling only as long as harmony holds. When that balance tilts, the proper response is movement, not collapse, correction. From this perspective, the abandonment of an ancient city or ceremonial centre takes on a different meaning. A place like Chaco, with its engineered roads reaching across the desert, or a site like Mesa Verde, with its cliff dwellings tucked into stone, might be understood as the material expression of a particular ceremonial era. When the obligations attached to that era are fulfilled, the covenant closes. The people do not fail the place has completed its work. Here is what makes this so challenging for outside researchers. Archaeology is trained to read drought in tree rings, conflict in burned palisades, trade in obsidian or copper carried across a continent-spanning network. It is far harder to see a moment when a community collectively understands that a landscape has become spiritually used up, that its power is now too concentrated, too heavy with ritual debt to inhabit safely. Some Pueblo oral traditions speak of villages that grew powerful, then dangerous, because too much ceremony had accumulated there, too many prayers laid down, too many obligations woven into the earthworks, plazas and kivas. In those accounts, people leave not because the architecture fails, but because it succeeds too well, drawing forces out of balance. The only way to restore harmony is to walk away, to let wind, rain and time slowly unwind what has been bound. For generations, researchers have tended to frame great silences as endings, drought-driven dispersal, political breakdown, abrupt collapse. Yet more archaeologists now sit with elders, listening to migration histories that stretch from Chaco to the Rio Grande, from Mesa Verde to modern pueblos. They admit that these spiritual logics cannot always be translated neatly into radiocarbon dates or stratigraphic layers. Still, they matter. They offer theories where evidence is not only material, but ceremonial. So settle in, because what you're about to discover is a profound alternative to familiar narratives of disaster. In this view, ancient Americans sometimes chose to walk away from greatness, to leave behind monumental walls, observatories, and intricate ritual networks for reasons that were necessary and sacred. What we are left with are sites that look abandoned, yet may, in another register, be perfectly complete. And that raises an unsettling possibility. If some departures were voluntary, what might the architecture itself reveal about who was meant to stay and who was always destined to move on? Imagine standing at Serpent Mound as dusk falls, the 300-foot body of the earthen snake dissolving into shadow, while the first stars appear in the same sky its coils seem to measure. In that charged silence with no written explanation, a familiar set of theories rushes in to fill the gap. Aliens, Atlantis, a forgotten master civilization that arrived, instructed and vanished. For generations, researchers have heard the same refrains at Cahokia's towering monk's mound, in the shadowed rooms of Chaco Canyon, and among undeciphered petroglyphs in the southwest. The claim is simple and seductive. that indigenous cultures could not have engineered such precise ceremonial earthworks, such vast trade networks, or such complex astronomical observatories without help from somewhere else. Sometimes the helpers are survivors of a drowned continent. Sometimes they are star beings with advanced technology. Always they stand outside the actual descendants of these places. Here is what makes these theories crumble under scrutiny. There is no credible physical evidence of alien tools, exotic alloys, or out-of-place machinery at Serpent Mound, at Mesa Verde, or in the ancient copper mines of the Great Lakes. No inscriptions in unknown star languages. No genetic signatures of a vanished super race. What does appear, over and over, are human fingerprints, experimental construction stages, rebuilding after collapse, local materials shaped with stone tools, and regional styles that evolve over centuries. Pseudo-linguistic comparisons try to bridge the gap, claiming that inscriptions on Dighton Rock or symbols near the Mississippi resemble Egyptian hieroglyphs or Old World alphabets. But under careful analysis, the similarities dissolve into coincidence and wishful pattern matching. No continuous texts, no bilingual Rosetta Stone, no sustained grammatical system, just isolated marks wrenched from their cultural context to support a theory that was decided in advance. There is also a deeper ethical cost. To say that an ancient alien civilization designed Cahokia's urban plan, or that Atlantean engineers laid out the alignments at Chaco Canyon, is to take the achievements of real peoples and hand them to imaginary benefactors. It erases the intellectual labor of ancestors whose descendants are alive today, maintaining ceremonies, languages, and oral histories that still speak about these earthworks and cities. So settle in with the discomfort for a moment. The scale and precision of these sites can feel uncanny. A serpent aligned to solstices and lunar standstills. Great houses raised from millions of sandstone blocks hauled across a harsh desert. Copper mined in staggering quantities and moved through a continental trade network. Without written records, the temptation is to reach for the most spectacular explanation. Yet the true story is already extraordinary. This was not a single moment of revelation delivered from the sky. This was a civilization of genuine complexity, or rather a constellation of civilizations, watching the heavens, reading the land, organizing labor, and negotiating with powerful spiritual landscapes over many generations. Human communities learned to turn soil, stone, and starlight into architecture and calendar, into memory and ceremony. What you're about to discover is how those human choices still echo in alignments and artifacts. And yet, in some places, there are patterns that do not yield so easily, symbols and silences that even the most careful evidence cannot fully resolve. What you're left with, after the arguments and the models and the competing theories, is the land itself, the shapes in the soil, the stones that did not move. Imagine stepping back into those spaces, not as a detective chasing a single answer, but as a listener arriving late to a conversation that has been going on for 1,000 years. On a ridge in southern Ohio, the Serpent Mound still uncoils across the hilltop, thus to 300 feet of earth shaped into a sinuous body and an open, oval mouth. Storms have rolled over it. Colonization cut roads and fences around it. Industrial smoke darkened its horizons. Yet the serpent remains, its curves still catching solstice light, its head still aligned toward the fading sun. This was not a single act of construction and abandonment. This was a deliberate inscription, an ancient earthwork that continues to dictate where trails pass, where visitors pause, where the imagination turns upward to the sky. On the Mississippi floodplain, Cahokia's terraces rise from the flat fields like stranded waves. Monk's Mound, plazas, and smaller platform mounds still anchor highways, rail lines, and suburbs that grew up around them. The city that once held perhaps 20,000 people is gone, its ceremonial fires long extinguished, its trade network dissolved, its collapse still debated by researchers. Yet the geometry of that vanished civilization still organizes the modern landscape in quiet ways, insisting that this ground is not blank, not neutral, not empty. Far to the southwest, the great houses of Chaco Canyon stand in their stark amphitheater of sandstone. Step inside a roofed room or descend a ladder into a reconstructed kiva, and the sound changes. The wind outside becomes a low murmur. Footsteps echo differently against masonry that has been watching the sky for a millennium. Here is what makes these places feel less like ruins and more like instruments. They continue to shape sound, shadow, and the movement of bodies long after the original ceremonies ended. At Mesa Verde or Bandelier, cliff dwellings cling to alcoves where midday sun blazes just beyond the threshold. In the shade, the air turns cool and still. No voices, no fires, no visible inhabitants. Just the faint smell of dust and juniper, the regular spacing of doorways and ladders, the sense that an entire way of life once nested in these ledges. No written records, no clear explanation, just silence and the haunting feeling that something profound happened here. So settle in with that silence for a moment. For generations, researchers have tried to translate every alignment, every petroglyph, every shard into data. There is value in that work. There is also value in standing on a mound summit with the wind pressing against your chest, in tracing a hand across a cool rock art panel in deep shade, in listening to Akiva's echo and recognizing that these are not just artifacts. These earthworks and dwellings are active presences, still participating in ongoing conversations about identity, memory, and responsibility. What you're about to discover is how those conversations continue, not only in laboratories and archives, but in living indigenous communities who still claim these landscapes as part of their past and their future. Imagine standing at Serpent Mound at dusk, the 3,100-foot earthen snake fading into shadow as the first stars appear overhead. Researchers trace alignments to solstices and lunar standstills, measure every curve, test every grain of soil. But for nearby Shawnee, Miami, and other native nations, this is not only an ancient puzzle waiting to be solved, it is a relative, a responsibility. Here is what makes many of these so-called mysteries more complicated than a missing blueprint or a lost inscription. For generations, researchers have framed Chaco Canyon, Cahokia, and the Great Lakes copper mines as abandoned stages where the actors vanished and left no script. Yet for Diné, Pueblo, Osage, Anishinaabe, and many others, these are still inhabited landscapes within a living cultural geography. They have names that are not on federal maps, stories that never entered an archive, obligations that extend forward, not just back. Those stories are not casual legends, they are memory systems. Oral traditions can encode migrations, droughts, and ceremonial protocols inside narratives that move with the people rather than staying locked in stone. A Pueblo account of journeys through different worlds, for example, can echo archaeological evidence of movement into and out of Chaco and Mesa Verde during periods of environmental stress. An Anishinaabe story about copper and thunder beings can sit alongside evidence of vast ancient mining and trade across the Great Lakes network. Narrative and data, spoken and excavated, sometimes converge in ways that are hard to dismiss. This does not mean every tale is a direct chronicle in disguise. It does mean that when an elder describes a place as a doorway, a teaching ground, or a site of dangerous power, that description may carry observational knowledge about water, climate, or astronomy, wrapped in ceremonial language. Some rock art that researchers label undeciphered is still read within living traditions as maps of relations among humans, animals, and sky beings. The vocabulary is different. The underlying intelligence is not. Yet not all knowledge is meant to be translated, catalogued, or filmed. Some communities choose to keep certain interpretations within closed ceremonial contexts, even when those interpretations could resolve academic debates about site function or chronology. No written records, no clear explanation, just a deliberate silence that protects relationships more important than any theory. What you're left with, as an outsider, is the reminder that not every mystery exists for outside consumption. So settle in with a different image of the expert. In recent decades, collaborative projects have brought archaeologists and indigenous knowledge keepers together at places like Cahokia, Chaco, and sacred rock art canyons. This was not a single token consultation. This was a civilization of genuine complexity being approached through multiple knowledge systems at once. Alignments once dismissed as coincidence gain meaning when matched with ceremonial calendars. Earthworks thought to be purely defensive reveal processional routes and teaching spaces when read alongside oral histories. In these moments, stewardship changes. excavation plans are altered to avoid burials identified through tradition. Interpretive signs shift from describing abandonment and collapse to emphasizing continuity, migration, and transformation. What you're about to discover, moving deeper into these ancient American mysteries, is that every earthwork, every petroglyph panel, every silent plaza ultimately circles back to living descendants. Their futures are intertwined with the care of these places, and any honest exploration must listen to those voices against the silence. That listening now includes something unexpected: the quiet hum of aircraft, the invisible sweep of lasers, the soft ping of signals bouncing through soil and stone. Imagine standing at the edge of a forest that seems ordinary, only to learn that above the canopy, in lines of light the human eye cannot see, an ancient city is being traced back into existence. For generations, researchers have walked fields around Cahokia and mapped the great plazas and towering mounds by hand. They saw the core of a metropolis. But LiDAR, fired from planes and drones, strips away trees and modern farm rows in its digital reconstructions, revealing faint embankments, erased borrow pits, and geometric earthworks stretching far beyond the known ceremonial centre. This was not a single cluster of mounds. This was a civilization of genuine complexity, with satellite communities, engineered causeways, and perhaps processional roads tying distant neighbourhoods into one ritual landscape. The same technology has redrawn the map of Chaco Canyon. Over what looks like empty desert, LiDAR has picked out low berms and linear features that match ancient roads, some running arrow straight for miles. No pavement, no stone curbs, no written directions. Yet there are corridors etched into the land, linking great houses, shrines, and outlying communities into a vast network of movement, ceremony, and trade. Beneath the surface, another wave of tools is at work. Ground-penetrating radar sends energy into the earth and listens for echoes, outlining buried walls, post holes, and chambers without lifting a single trowel of soil. High-resolution satellite data and drone imaging catch subtle crop marks and moisture differences that betray ditches, plazas, and forgotten foundations. No trenches, no destruction, no irreversible cuts. What emerges instead is a ghost architecture, a layered blueprint of cultures that rose, transformed, and moved on. So settle in, because here is what makes this technological moment so powerful. It does not just protect fragile sites by reducing excavation, it multiplies questions. At mound complexes long thought finished, radar reveals earlier construction phases sealed beneath later platforms. At Chacoan great houses, buried kivas appear where none were expected, hinting at shifts in ceremonial focus, authority, or outside influence that written records never describe. In the lab, time itself is being sharpened. Advances in radiocarbon dating, calibrated against tree rings and other records, refine chronologies down to decades instead of centuries. Isotopic analysis of teeth and bone tracks where individuals grew up, drank water, and ate their food, exposing migration routes and marriage alliances that cross mountains and rivers. Ancient DNA, handled under sterile conditions and strict ethical review, can show deep connections between populations once thought unrelated, and continuity between ancestral builders and living native nations, who have long said, in their own ways, that these are their places. Each new layer of detail might be expected to simplify the story. It does the opposite. Extra phases of construction appear at Serpent Mound. Unexpected outsiders show up in the genetic and isotopic record at Cahokia. Timelines for so-called collapses blur into protracted transformations, with people dispersing along rivers and into uplands rather than simply vanishing. What we are left with is not a single master narrative, but intersecting histories, branching paths, and unfinished arguments. What you're about to discover in the next mysteries is that as the tools sharpen, the outlines only grow more intricate. The land is giving up hidden patterns, yet the meaning of those patterns still depends on how carefully they are read and on who is invited into the conversation. The land is the text. The question is how it is read. Imagine driving across the Midwest past warehouse lots and interstates when a low, tree-covered rise slides by your passenger window. No sign, no monument, just a hill. Yet beneath that quiet profile, in places like Cahokia near present-day St. Louis, once stood a city of plazas, pyramidal mounds, and ceremonial avenues. At its height, tens of thousands lived there, This was not a single village tucked into a forest. This was a civilization of genuine complexity. Researchers now map neighborhoods, palisades, and causeways buried under suburbs and farm fields. They see evidence of intensive agriculture radiating out from the central earthworks, of fields engineered to manage floods, of storage pits that fed a dense population. Similar revelations unfold at Chaco Canyon, where great houses rise from a desert that is anything but empty. Roads extend for miles, irrigation features and check dams capture precious water. Even in harsh environments, the land was managed like a living instrument. Across the continent, the older myth lingers that pre-contact North America was a sparsely peopled wilderness, a vast untouched backdrop awaiting discovery. No palace walls, no marble inscriptions, no iron monuments. What emerged instead were cities in earth, forests trimmed and replanted, rivers coaxed and redirected. Here is what makes this so easy to miss. Later ploughs, logging and construction have scraped away many of the clearest signatures of that labour. Ancient fields have been levelled into anonymous farmland. Canal systems in the southeast and southwest lie choked beneath wetlands, subdivisions and reservoirs. Modified forests, once mosaics of nut groves, berry patches and fire-shaped openings, now read as natural woodland. What you're about to discover in LiDAR scans and soil cores is that many so-called pristine vistas are cultural palimpsests, layered with choices made generation after generation. For generations, researchers have treated indigenous societies as if they were static, repeating the same patterns until contact shattered them. The new evidence tells a different story. Chaco's great houses rose and were abandoned, not in a single simple collapse, but through cycles of expansion, reorganization, and migration. Cahokia's influence rippled along trade routes that carried copper from the Great Lakes, shells from the Gulf Coast, and ideas from far beyond the horizon. These were dynamic cultures, experimental, adaptive, and capable of large-scale planning. So settle in with that image the next time an unmarked hill, a straight line of trees, or an oddly regular meadow passes outside the car window. What if that gentle slope is a buried platform mound? What if that canyon, apparently untouched, once echoed with ritual gatherings, with the sound of water guided through hand-cut channels? The mystery is not that there is nothing there. The mystery is how much remains unseen, and how the next site on this journey may force the continent to be read yet again, from the ground up. The mystery is not only in the ground, it is in the questions that refuse to close. Imagine walking the ridge above Serpent Mound, tracing that 300-foot earthen body as it coils toward a celestial alignment, and realizing that after a century of excavation and argument, its original purpose still hangs just out of reach. Here is what makes that uncertainty powerful. Not knowing is not only a deficit, a gap waiting to be filled with the next paper or the next theory. That uncertainty preserves a space for wonder, for respect, for the quiet recognition that an ancient civilization could encode meanings into earthworks, skylines, and trade routes that later cultures may never fully translate. The serpent still looks back. The question still stands. For generations, researchers have mapped every room at Chaco Canyon and every plaza at Cahokia. They can calculate how many sandstone blocks were cut, how many timbers were dragged from 50 miles away, how many people might have crowded into those ceremonial plazas at midwinter. Yet the central riddles remain. Why build so big in such a harsh canyon? Why did a city larger than medieval London rise from the Mississippi floodplain and then unravel in little more than a century? Confronting those limits is not a failure of science. It is a reminder that human history is broader and stranger than any single narrative can capture. No written proclamations, no royal portraits, no clear declarations of power. What they left instead were earthworks, petroglyphs, copper scars on the Great Lakes bedrock, faint alignments between horizon notches and lunar standstills, evidence without a full script. In many indigenous traditions, that unfinished script is not a problem to be erased. Mystery itself is ceremonial. Some questions are meant to remain open-ended, held in story, song, and protocol rather than pinned to a single explanation. A spiral carved into desert rock can be a calendar, a teaching, a reminder of emergence, all at once. A great house can be a network node, a place of pilgrimage, a memory palace for origin histories. This was not a single function, a single meaning, a single story. Then comes the pattern interrupt. The impulse is to demand closure, to insist that every disappearance be labelled collapse, every migration reduced to drought or warfare. But what if the more honest response is to accept that some movements leave only directional traces, that some copper, some ceremonies, some names simply flowed back into the continent's living cultures and did not stay where archaeologists prefer to dig? Living with these enigmas changes how the present looks. Modern cities feel less permanent when Cahokia's empty plazas enter the imagination. Modern languages feel less complete when undeciphered symbols stare out from canyon walls. The blind spots of this age become easier to sense when remembering how much was unseen in theirs. So settle in with that discomfort. What you're about to discover in the closing steps of this journey is that once these traces have been noticed, they do not fade. Once the landscape has been read as archive and ancestor, it cannot be unread. What we are left with is a kind of initiation, a new way of seeing carried forward into every horizon line, every river bend, every quiet rise of earth along the road ahead. So settle in and imagine walking those landscapes again, this time with the new eyes you have earned. The horizon is no longer empty. Every ridge, every shadowed valley, every quiet rise of ground now feels like a page in an ancient archive, turned slowly under an enormous sky. You return first to the Serpent Mound, a sinuous body of earth more than 300 feet long, coiling across the Ohio ridge as if frozen mid-movement, its head aligned to the setting sun at the summer solstice, its curves echoing lunar standstills that take generations to track. No written records, no royal decree, no single name to attach to its creation. What they left instead was an earthwork that proves careful observation, repeated ceremony, and a culture willing to move tens of thousands of baskets of soil for an idea. Then the view shifts, and you're gliding once more through Chaco Canyon's great houses and Mesa Verde's cliff dwellings. Multi-story masonry blocks rise from a harsh, marginal desert, their timbers hauled from forests more than 50 miles away, their rooms aligned to solstice light and cardinal directions. Above, the abandoned towers at Mesa Verde cling to sandstone alcoves, tucked into the rock like watchful eyes. Here is what makes these places so haunting. This was not a single village that failed. This was a civilization of genuine complexity, organized for ceremony, for trade, for long-distance networks of obligation and belief, and then, over generations, its great centers were left behind. Drought, conflict, spiritual reorientation. There are theories, but no final verdict. Far to the east, the ground swells again into mounds. Cahokia rises in memory, a metropolis near present-day St. Louis that once held perhaps 10,000 to 20,000 people, its central pyramid mound towering above plazas, its wood-hinged circle catching the sun at equinox and solstice. Imagine a city here when many European towns were still small and fortified, a place of markets, rituals, and rulers whose very names are lost. Today, suburban houses and highways ring what is left. Grassy forms under a Midwestern sky, mute about the processes of rise and collapse that played out here. On canyon walls across the southwest, rock art panels stretch like illuminated manuscripts, horned figures, spirals, starbursts that may echo eclipses or supernovas, hunting scenes and beings that seem half human, half otherworldly. Around the Great Lakes, ancient mine pits scar the bedrock, silent evidence of copper pulled from the earth thousands of years ago, far more than the known artifacts can account for. Intimate marks, industrial scars. Together they hint at scientific awareness, ceremonial obligation, and economic systems that ran along river and shoreline long before written chronicles. Taken together, these are not scattered curiosities. They're a constellation of mysteries, each point connected by invisible lines of memory, trade, and shared sky. For generations, researchers have tried to map those lines, to turn fragments into narrative, evidence into history. What you're about to discover is that the deeper those connections run, the less the continent resembles a blank slate awaiting discovery, and the more it reveals itself as an ancient, densely storied world, one whose next revelations may still be written in the land beneath your feet. So settle in for a moment on that last image, the the continent no longer as a blank map, but as a dense palimpsest of memory and design. Imagine every familiar highway, every subdivision, every downtown skyline floating above older lines that do not show up on satellite images or zoning plans. Lines of pilgrimage, lines of ceremony, lines of observation and obligation. Here is what makes these ancient mysteries more than distant curiosities. The Serpent Mound coiled along an Ohio ridge, the vanished great houses of Chaco Canyon, the towering mounds of Cahokia rising from the Mississippi floodplain. Each one shows a culture that watched the sky, measured the seasons, and reshaped the land with deliberate intent. No written records, no surviving blueprints, yet the alignments with solstices, lunar standstills, and star paths are precise. This was not a single isolated effort. This was a civilization of genuine complexity, mirrored in copper mines around the Great Lakes, in rock art that tracks eclipses and supernovas, in trade routes that stitched forests, prairies, and deserts into a continuous network. For generations, researchers have tried to explain why such centers rose and why they transformed or appeared to collapse. Climate swings that dried fields, resource strain in overused forests, social tensions and shifting alliances. These theories carry real evidence. Pollen trapped in lake mud, charcoal layers from burned plazas, abandoned irrigation canals crossing now barren ground. But what we are left with is still incomplete, because the oral histories of indigenous nations speak of migrations instructed in visions, of the need to restore balance when a place becomes spiritually out of tune, of sacred landscapes that must be left to rest. Those perspectives do not cancel the scientific models, they widen them. A drought is not only a weather event, it can be a sign that relationships among people, animals, waters, and ancestors have been disturbed. A move away from Chaco or Mesa Verde is not just a failure of agriculture, it can be the fulfillment of a long-promised journey. When a place like Serpent Mound is understood as ceremonial ground, as a living being in the shape of earthworks and horizon lines, questions about who built it and why begin to look different. Carrying that expanded sense of time into the present changes how modern landscapes are seen. A city like St. Louis no longer begins with French forts and riverboats. It sits in the shadow of Cahokia's forgotten skyline. A quiet ridge in Ohio is not simply a scenic overlook. It may be a carefully chosen vantage point in a continent-spanning observatory. Debates over pipelines, mining, and development unfold on ground that may hold buried plazas, effigy mounds, and story-rich sites that have never been mapped. Recognizing the depth of indigenous history is not just an intellectual exercise, not just a set of dates and enigmatic earthworks to marvel at. It is a step toward a more informed respect for the native nations still living with and speaking for these places. Treaties, land claims, and calls for protection are not abstract politics when the land itself is understood as archive, as relative, as teacher. So the question becomes, what will be done with this new map of the past? Once the invisible cities, ceremonial centers, and copper trails are seen beneath the surface of the modern world, it becomes harder to accept simple stories of discovery and empty wilderness. The next time a roadside marker points to a mound, a ruin, or a petroglyph site, it will not just mark a tourist stop. It will mark an entry point into a different way of seeing the continent and a different responsibility to those whose stories still live in the ground. Those entry points are not just metaphors on a map. They are real gates in the landscape, places where the distance between screen and soil narrows until the mystery feels close enough to touch. Imagine stepping out of a car and realizing that the low ridge on the horizon is not a hill at all, but an ancient design. At Serpent Mound in Ohio, the earth itself coils into a 1,300-foot serpent, its open mouth aligned toward the setting sun on the longest day of the year, its curves echoing lunar cycles that take decades to complete. This was not a single casual project. This was a civilization of genuine complexity, moving millions of baskets of soil into a precise ceremonial form. Visitors today walk a path along its edges, not across its body, because the first lesson in entering such a place is restraint. No climbing on the embankment, no shortcuts, no treating a sacred earthwork as a playground. The same is true in the vast stone corridors of Chaco Culture National Historical Park, in the cliff dwellings of Mesa Verde, and on the broad terraces of Cahokia mounds. At Chaco, great houses rise from a harsh desert basin, their walls made from millions of sandstone blocks and timbers carried from distant mountains. At Cahokia, the flat summit of Monk's Mound once anchored a political and ceremonial centre, larger than many medieval European cities. Here is what makes these sites different from a typical tourist stop. Every plaza, kiva and mound is still part of an ongoing relationship with descendant communities. So settle into a different way of visiting. Museums, tribal cultural centres, and indigenous-led tours at places like Mesa Verde, Chaco, and regional rock art sites offer narratives that archaeological signage alone cannot carry. Guides from Pueblo, Diné, Osage, Shawnee, and other nations speak not only about dates and artifacts, but about obligations, songs, and protocols. For generations, researchers have mapped walls and measured alignments. Descendant communities remember responsibilities. For those unable to travel, the network is still there, just in another form. Tribal nation websites share position papers on sacred sites and rock art. Documentaries and recorded academic lectures explore theories about Cahokia's rise and collapse, or the undeciphered figures carved into canyon walls across the southwest. Books on indigenous astronomy, on mound-building cultures, on Great Lakes copper trade routes extend what you're hearing now into deeper study. What you are left with is not just more information, but a different frame. Approach each petroglyph panel, each mound, each abandoned great house with humility. No touching rock art, no chalk, no rubbings, no tracing, no removing even a shard of pottery or a flake of stone. Think of yourself as a guest in a home whose hosts have been here for thousands of years, whether or not you can see them. That same respectful curiosity can become preservation. Park memberships, small donations to tribal historic preservation offices, volunteer days, or simply correcting a casual remark that calls these places ruins with no living heirs. All of these acts feed the fragile line of protection. Because as more visitors arrive, drawn by the mystery, another question emerges in the shadows of these earthworks and canyon walls. Who exactly will decide what survives the next century of looking? So settle in with one last image. Imagine yourself standing once more at dusk, the light draining from the sky as you climb a low rise of earthworks, or pick your way along a canyon trail. The air is cooling, the colours are fading. What you're left with are outlines and silhouettes, and the quiet realization that most of this ancient story still lives just beyond the edge of certainty. Beneath your boots, a mound coils like a buried thought, recalling Serpent Mound's long earthen body, aligned to solstice sunsets and lunar standstills. On the cliff beside you, petroglyphs glow in the last angled light, like those in the southwest that some researchers match to eclipses and supernovas. Above you, the first stars appear where ancestral astronomers once tracked cycles that guided ceremonial calendars and trade. No written records, no clear explanation, just silence and the haunting feeling that something profound happened here. For generations, researchers have mapped every stone at Chaco, measured every post hole at Cahokia, traced every copper scar along the Great Lakes. They have LiDAR-scanned buried plazas, re-examined artifacts in museum drawers, and listened more carefully to oral histories that never truly went quiet. Each new discovery feels like a revelation, a new alignment, a reinterpreted symbol, a remembered story. Here is what makes these mysteries so enduring. Each fragment clarifies one corner of the mosaic, even as the picture itself keeps expanding. This was not a single puzzle with a single missing piece. This was a civilization of genuine complexity, spread across continents and centuries, connected by rivers and trails and a network of memory. Earthworks in Ohio, great houses in the desert, copper quarries on cold northern islands, canyon walls carved with spirals and starbursts, all of it part of a pattern that will never be completely finished. What you're left with is not a solved riddle, but an ongoing conversation between evidence and imagination, between scientific theories and living tradition. If that conversation calls to you, let this not be the last step. Subscribe to this channel to keep traveling deeper into ancient landscapes and the mysteries they still guard. Like this video if these questions feel worth the time it takes to walk slowly, to look closely, to let easy answers collapse under closer scrutiny. Share it with someone who still thinks these cultures were simple, who has never stood before a mound or a rock panel and felt the ground itself pushing back against that idea. Down in the comments, add your own fragment. A thoughtful question that lingers. A favourite site that changed how you see this land. A personal experience at Chaco, at Mesa Verde, at a small unmarked mound near your hometown that refuses to explain itself. Think of that space not as a place for final verdicts, but as an extension of the firelit circle, where perspectives are offered, held, and sometimes revised. Imagine the camera pulling away from you now, the lone figure on an ancient site shrinking as the horizon widens. The mound becomes a line, the canyon becomes a crease, the rock art fades into the cliff face. Above it all, the sky fills with stars, the same stars watched by those who built, who carved, who aligned. As long as someone looks up and someone else digs down, the dialogue between past and present will continue. The mystery does not end here. It waits in the next question, the next journey, the next night you stand listening to the dark.